Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 338. Thanks to the fact that this is the last weekend of February 2025, it is of course time for the Patreon Drydock, and buckle in because oh boy, a lot of people asked a lot of questions this month. Andrew Kirshenman asks, the Royal Air Force didn't allow any long-range bombers to be used for maritime patrol when they would have been the most useful. How many would have been needed to turn the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic in its early days, and how many ships or lives could realistically have been preserved? Well, based on the impact of aircraft like the Liberator when it finally entered Coastal Command service as a long-range anti-submarine aircraft, it would appear that a few dozen would probably be your minimum floor, so 3 to 4 squadrons worth to actually have a meaningful impact. But of course, that would mean that behind the scenes you'd have to keep supplying the squadrons with aircraft because of, there'd be operational losses, technical losses to broken engines and things like that. So you're probably looking at maybe a force of 60 odd aircraft initially, and then supplementing them maybe 6 months later with further production batches. Which aircraft was used would also be something of an issue, because if you want to use the Liberator, which ended up being the most useful and practical of the aircraft, you can't really advance the Liberator getting into Coastal Command service by that much. Maybe by 3 to 6 months if you're absolutely at a push, but that's really about it. Now, you could have some British-built heavy bombers enter service with Coastal Command earlier. Historically, the RAF turned around and said, no, you can't have them, because we want them to bomb the Germans. Of the 3 big 4-engine bombers that the RAF used in large numbers, the Lancaster is theoretically the most optimal, but also the last to enter service. It entered service in 1941, whereas the Halifax and the Stirling both enter service in 1940, and both of them would be later superseded to a certain degree by the Lancaster. Of the 2 that enter service in 1940, the Stirling is probably actually the slightly more suitable, because while it does have its drawbacks in operations over Germany relative to the Halifax, it crucially has a significantly longer range than the Halifax, whereas if you were going to do a Coastal Command Halifax version, you'd have to sacrifice at least some of the bomb, or in this case depth charge carrying capacity, for additional fuel tanks to make best use of the aircraft. And that in turn could lead to a closing of the mid-Atlantic air gap maybe a year, or possibly even slightly earlier than that, compared to when it was historically closed. Now, as for how many ships or lives could realistically have been preserved, that is unfortunately an incredibly open question. I think you'd have to do an awful lot of analysis to even come close to a figure where you could go, maybe this is approximately right. It's tempting to take the drop in sinkings when the Liberator started operating across the mid-Atlantic air gap and use that. But of course, the U-boats at the time were present in very different numbers, had different amounts of operational experience, and the U-boats themselves had somewhat different capabilities during that time period, as did the Liberators, with things like, good air-to-surface radar, etc. Whereas if you were to, say, take a couple of squadrons of short Stirlings up in autumn 1940, they're not going to have as advanced equipment. The U-boats also aren't going to have as advanced equipment, and therefore exactly how many casualties would be suffered on both sides would be very different. But, of course, it would undoubtedly have saved quite a number of ships and lives, just depending on, obviously, when and where the aircraft were deployed. The Rogue Chief asks, in my master's study on US military relations with China during World War II, there were 3 individuals I've come across who seem to be complete idiots. In your own research, has there ever been anyone you've likewise come across who made you groan and just ask, why? It happens fairly regularly, at least as an initial reaction, but there's only a few people that, after further reading, I still find myself asking, why was this person ever in command? Why is this person still making these decisions? And that's because, obviously, with hindsight, it's very easy to point at any number of historical figures and go, look, you really shouldn't have done that. That was a really dumb decision. However, when you look further, or if you already understand further, you can see why, given the information they had at the time, what they initially did might seem to make a certain degree of sense. Or even if objectively it was a dumb thing, they might even have understood it was a dumb thing, but they had to do it anyway because that's what they'd been ordered to do, so they're making the best of a bad job. But occasionally you do run into an individual where they persist in making bad decisions, despite the fact that even with purely what they had available to them at the time, there wasn't really no further excuses left after the first or second times. Of course, the obvious poster child to that is Beatty. You know, okay, nepotism is not a great thing by any stretch of the imagination, and it was to a certain degree dying out in the Royal Navy, so he was a little bit of a holdout for that by bringing Seymour aboard. But okay, you can perhaps see a certain logic from his perspective for bringing Seymour aboard at the time. But after Dogger Bank, it becomes less excusable. And for the situation to develop to the point that it had by Jutland, extremely inexcusable. And it gets still worse, like I mentioned in my video on Admiral King. Beatty still didn't seem to have a grasp of proper command and control of his ships even by the end of the war. And yeah, at that point, you're just left asking why. Another one, which you might have guessed from this picture, is General MacArthur. You know, for all the fact that he gets bigged up in certain elements of Allied propaganda, apart from the whole, oh yeah, I'm going to come back to the Philippines thing, which I think is probably what saved his career, because that was a big propaganda thing for the US, and obviously if they turned around and said, oh yeah, well this guy promised to go back to the Philippines, we're going to can him, that would have been a big hit, especially early in the war from a morale perspective. But an awful lot of the decisions he made, they don't make sense on almost any level. You know, obviously from a naval perspective, the fact he's an army general and is therefore mostly understandably obsessed with land campaigns rather than sea campaigns, so he sees the Navy as an auxiliary to enable him to do his land stuff. That's kind of understandable, but the way he goes about it, the targets he tries to select, he's basically trying to drive his entire war effort, and in fact insisting in the first place on having his own sector of the war effort to start with. But he's driving it almost entirely predicated on one thing he said while evacuating the Philippines, as opposed to actual proper military strategy. The less said about his continued attempts to conquer the entirety of New Guinea when, you know, Japan is several thousand miles further north, the better. The other two that I would put on the list would be, one, okay, perhaps almost predictably in second place behind Beatty, but that would be Billy Mitchell. As I'll cover in more detail when we get to the Drydock that covers his video, my problem with him is not so much that he was an advocate for air power. That was a relatively reasonable position to take. And to a certain extent, although I do object to it, I'm not even particularly against him because of his shenanigans with disobeying orders, putting people's lives at risk, etc. during the tests against Ostfriesland, or even his wildly exaggerated claims as a result of it. My main problem with him is that he advocated for the single least effective form of aerial attack on ships, essentially, as far as I can tell, because he wanted the Air Force to be in charge of aerial assault, whereas he seemed to see at the time torpedo bombers as possibly something the Navy could use, and therefore that couldn't possibly stand. At which point he's subordinating actual proper defence to his own personal vanity and inter-service rivalry. And at some point you just have to ask, why exactly do you think your personal prejudices and quest for glory somehow supersedes the potential defense of the nation, because you ain't going to get much glory or ambition fulfilled if the nation loses a war with you at its head or near its head. And for similar reasons, I would also have to nominate someone who most of you probably haven't heard of, Admiral Lestock of the Royal Navy back in the 1700s, because during a battle led by Admiral Matthews, the Battle of Toulon, one of several battles of Toulon, but anyway, Lestock decided that, mostly because he didn't like Matthews, when Matthews chose to engage the enemy fleet, Lestock and his section basically sat out and watched the fight take place, which turned it from a fight which the Royal Navy could quite easily have won into a very small section of the fleet fighting vastly outnumbered against a fortunately somewhat disorganized Franco-Spanish force. And yeah, I mean, if Mitchell was gambling with the future of his nation in peacetime, Lestock was gambling with the future of his nation in the midst of an actual battle based purely on personal prejudice. I tend to agree with John Campbell's assessment in that he should have been shot rather than Bing. Ben asks, listening to a podcast, the host mentioned that being in the mechanical areas of the ship were the most deadly, with it being the hardest to get out of. That makes sense, but you would also be relatively sheltered from damage that wasn't going to sink the ship. Do we know if there was a major difference in life expectancy based on where you were stationed in the ship in World War I or World War II? I don't know if anyone's done a full study of casualties and where they were in a ship. I mean, obviously, when you get a ship that explodes, casualties are almost all completely total, so that doesn't really help. But from what I've observed looking at various ships as they're damaged or destroyed, then yes, being down in the machinery spaces is the most dangerous place to be in a ship that is heavily damaged or sunk. Although I'd leaned more towards sunk, because if the machinery spaces suffer a major breach in any way, shape or form, then the ship usually is sunk. Whereas if a ship is heavily damaged but makes it home, that usually, not entirely, but usually means the machinery spaces have remained intact. So I think you've got a bit of a binary situation there. If the ship is going down, you really don't want to be assigned to the machinery spaces. If it's not, yeah, that's probably actually a fairly safe place to be. The other two areas where you see the most casualties in more general battle situations, where a ship isn't sunk, tend to be the secondary battery, and that actually holds true in either World War I or World War II, because by surface area, the secondary battery tends to occupy a fair amount of a ship's broadside, and regardless of whether it's a 6-inch secondary battery in World War I or 20mm, 40mm, whatever anti-aircraft guns in World War II, they tend not to have enough armour for their position. Now, to be fair, those mounts will generally have some armour, but if you're in a 6-inch casement battery, you're not going to have the armour to protect you if an 11, 12, 13.5 or 15-inch shell comes crashing in. And if you're in a 20mm or 40mm battery in World War II, kamikazes, nearby general-purpose bombs, or strafing runs by 20mm autocannon are also not going to respect your splinter shielding. Now, that's not to say that armour is completely useless. It is, of course, splinter-proof against more distant explosions and so forth. And if you were a battleship under attack by cruisers or destroyers' guns, then your 6-inch casement battery armour would stand you in good stead. But generally speaking, the secondary battery does seem to be an area that incurs relatively high casualties in any kind of major engagement where the ship starts to take hits. The other area is the ship's superstructure. Now, usually there aren't that many people actually in that area during combat. In World War I, there isn't actually all that much to a ship's superstructure, and in World War II, although superstructures tend to be larger, a lot of it is accommodation, so again, there's not a huge amount of people there. But again, proportional to the overall size of the ship, it's a relatively large amount of surface area, especially in the Second World War, and is essentially completely unprotected, so when it does take hits, there tend to be fairly major casualties, either among bridge crew or possibly casualty receiving stations and things like that. And that's essentially because if you look at every other part of the ship, areas outside the citadel but part of the hull are generally sparsely manned or unmanned during combat, because it tends to be mostly accommodation and storage areas, and the ship's main armament is both a relatively small target and fairly heavily protected. So although you do get cases where people in a ship's main turrets do take horrific casualties if a shell hits hard enough to actually penetrate and detonate, it's relatively speaking rare compared to secondary battery and superstructure casualties. Michael Williams asks, what do you think were the strategic and tactical advantages that the Age of Sail Royal Navy had due to the large-scale copper production in South Wales, which allowed them to put cladding on warship hulls? There were quite a few advantages to that. I mean, obviously the Royal Navy was the first to figure out how to properly affix copper plating, i.e. sheathing, to the hulls of their warships in order to reduce the amount of foreign marine growth on their ships, which obviously would then lessen the degradation of the hulls and also help them maintain their speed. So that was in and of itself an advantage. But the single biggest issue is that they were the only one of the three big navies in the Napoleonic Wars to have their own large-scale accessible copper production. And that essentially comes down to logistics win wars, because the Royal Navy could reliably access large amounts of copper, and in a pinch, since it's wartime, the price could to a certain degree be controlled because it's a local source. Now, both France and Spain do have their own natural sources of copper, but they are relatively minimal compared to that which was accessible at the time in South Wales. France generally just doesn't have all that much, and Spain did, but the easiest to access and largest capacity sources were mined out pretty much by the Romans, and by the 18th century they were having to drain and reactivate old Roman copper mines to see what was left, which of course was a much bigger, much more complex and expensive exercise than here's a bunch of fresh ore. In France's case, prior to the Napoleonic Wars, most copper used in France was imported from Sweden, and in Spain's case, although as I said they did have some greater copper production at home than France did, they were also sourcing a lot of their copper from overseas, particularly from what was called New Spain at the time, which is nowadays Mexico and various other Central American countries. And of course, in the Napoleonic Wars, an era where the Royal Navy was really getting into its blockade game, you can see the obvious weakness. Because yes, Sweden was quite happy to trade with everybody, but if the Royal Navy could blockade warlike materials, and copper would be counted as that, from getting to Europe, then the supply was significantly reduced for the French, and of course, being a third-party dealer, if everybody wants copper, then a third-party dealer like Sweden can charge a lot more for copper, which makes putting large amounts of copper on the hulls of your fleet considerably more expensive for the French than it would be for the British, even assuming they had enough copper. And similarly for the Spanish, they can trade some of their copper with the French, who will pay a pretty penny for it over land, because that's obviously immune to blockade. But of course that also puts the price up for their own ships, and copper is still used in a huge variety of other industrial applications, including the manufacture of guns and the refining of gold and silver. And with the majority of Spain's copper coming in from their colonies in Central and South America, especially Central America, again, British blockade and British interception of their convoys and so forth significantly reduces the amount of copper they have, which also, not just you have enough copper to actually plate your ships, but also how much is that going to cost you, as compared to the Royal Navy, where they could just go, yep, we'll have another several hundred tons of copper out of South Wales, please. It's kind of a similar situation to Germany and coal in World War I, in that, yes, there was plenty of anthracite coal in the world to fuel the high seas fleet. The only problem was it wasn't in Germany, and the Royal Navy had this thing called blockade going on, which made it very difficult for you to access your pre-war overseas sources. Alternate historian Turtleduck asks, during the Dunkirk evacuations, did the Royal Navy or French Navy provide offshore fire support to the French and British Army? And if not, why not? They didn't, and there were several good reasons for this. Firstly, it was very much a thing at that point that the Luftwaffe was on the offensive, and putting cruisers or battleships into the relatively confined waters off of Dunkirk in the face of a Luftwaffe that was able to break through even the RAF and the L'Armée de Air's best efforts at stopping them was widely recognised as being a good way to lose a ship, because if they're doing shore-based fire support, they're going to have to be sitting not static but relatively stationary and in a relatively known location so they can come under repeated air attack. Another issue is that the ability to coordinate with the troops that are holding the Germans back on the front lines and thus arrange for reasonably accurate shore-based fire support to hit the Germans and not hit your own troops, that technology and training really isn't there in 1940 compared to what it would be later on in the war, so you could end up doing more damage than help. Another issue is the waters around Dunkirk are pretty shallow, and that would mean that any cruisers or battleships doing offshore fire support be a fair distance away, and that would obviously again mitigate their accuracy and their ability to respond. And anything smaller than that, destroyers and down that were shallow draft enough to get in, well, they're much better served actually doing evacuations than sitting offshore and relatively randomly and ineffectually bombarding random areas of the French countryside. And on a much larger scale, around the time that the Dunkirk evacuation is occurring, you've got the last stages of the Norwegian campaign, so you've got a lot of Royal Navy capital ship assets tied up assisting in the evacuation there. And you've also got the Italians about to enter the war, and everybody can kind of see that coming. So you've got the Mediterranean Fleet and the Marine Nationale scrambling to redeploy forces to guard against that. Plus, of course, the ever-present threat of a potential German breakout of large ships into the Atlantic. So there's plenty else to occupy the Allied navies at that point, apart from Dunkirk. So cruisers and battleships, even if they wanted to send them in the face of the Luftwaffe, etc., and all the other issues we've just identified, probably just flat out aren't available. Now, that's not to say that the ships that were there, the destroyers particularly, didn't offer some kind of fire support when they could. They absolutely did. However, it was much more local, much more on an ad hoc basis, and much more we can physically see a German column of troops or vehicles, so we're going to have at it, especially in the latter stages when German snipers in the town itself were taking potshots at the bridges of various destroyers. And I've related before the story of one particular destroyer crew who at one point reported a Panzer IV driving out onto a quayside during the last stages of the evacuation and rather unwisely antagonizing the destroyer with its machine gun, which resulted in the destroyer using its much heavier gun to essentially blow the Panzer IV off the quay and into the water. Daniel Silverthorne asks, what was the main bottleneck causing the shortage of steel in the US in the 1940s, and what could have been done to resolve this production issue? The main bottleneck was the sheer complexity of the steel industry in terms of what you need to actually manufacture good quality steel versus the colossal increase in demand, because it's not just a case of, increase steel production by building more steel factories. The US was building more steel factories. The existing ones were put on 24-hour shifts with additional workers brought in, obviously, and old mills that had perhaps gone under in the Great Depression were being reactivated. Retired steel workers were being called back in, partly to work themselves, but also to teach new recruits how to work the steel mills. But once you've got a steel mill fully staffed and working 24/7, that's it. It can only produce so much steel, and it takes time to build new steel factories. And then on top of that, for every bit of additional capacity you have in the steel industry, so even if we take as a very, very basic example, okay, we have an existing factory, disregarding new builds, disregarding reactivating old ones, we've got an existing steel factory, okay, it's now going to 24/7 operation. Let's say, for the sake of argument, this doubles its output. Well, that means it needs double the coke to fuel the furnaces. It needs double the limestone and other derivative products to treat the incoming iron. It needs double the iron ore, etc., etc. It needs double of everything that goes into making steel, and there's quite a lot of stuff that goes into making steel. And of course, if you're going to use something like coke, that means you need to double the output of your coking furnaces, and that means you need to double, let's say, coal output, and that means you have to find new staff for your coking factories and for your coal mines, and perhaps open new ones of both of those if they're not able to double their output because maybe they're already operating at 2/3 potential maximum output. And all of that involves a lot of money. So to increase steel production, even though ironically steel is what's used to make the tools that then make the tanks and the planes and the ships, to increase your steel production itself is also almost a case of the tools to make the tools to make the tools, because you've got to increase the output and number of your basic raw material extraction processes, of which there are several. Then you've got to increase the number and capacity of the secondary processing of a number of those basic raw resources, and then in combination with other raw resources, those processed resources all then go en masse to the steel mill, which then produces the steel, which can be sent off to other factories to make tools and planes and all other sorts of things. And as far as resolving that bottleneck, there isn't really a huge amount you could do. The only real things you potentially could do to substantially increase US steel output in the 1940s during the World War II period would probably be, one, obviously this is using hindsight quite a bit, but would be perhaps to start all your processes to eventually increase steel output a year or two earlier, because that would obviously ramp up your production levels a lot sooner. And then even if you're not using all that steel immediately, you would be able to build up a strategic stockpile of steel for perhaps when your demand exceeds your output. And the other thing would just be to throw even more money at the situation. Now, throwing more money at the situation isn't necessarily going to massively increase the output of all the various materials as we've discussed, but you could, although it'd be a very hard political sell, use some of that money to increase raw resource production in other countries, particularly Canada, because it's got a land border. And if you can make Canadian or perhaps even overseas sources, if you want to ship things back in empty ships that would otherwise, be coming in on convoys, then if you can increase their output beyond the capacity of their local industries to process, then some of that extra raw material or processed material could come back to your steel factories, which would let you concentrate your own funding on perhaps just increasing steel factory building as opposed to having to also expand your tail-end logistics network. Alex Muskowitz asks, the 20-inch Rodman gun supposedly had a range of 8,000 yards. Hitting a target that range seems a tad optimistic for me with mid-1800s weapons. What would have been the effective combat range of this weapon? At the time of its deployment, it really depends on what its target is, because of course the 20-inch Rodman was deployed as a coastal defence gun. So it doesn't face the problems that a lot of guns would in the Navy of being mounted on a moving platform that's pitching and rolling. The ground, generally speaking, doesn't tend to do that, although it is the US, so depending on where it was installed, there is a potential during an earthquake that would happen. But if you're engaging an enemy fleet while an earthquake is wrecking your fort, you've clearly angered some sort of deity, and you're probably best off surrendering at that point anyway. So assuming normal stable firing conditions, the Rodman would have had a somewhat more effective range than the 1,000 to 1,500 yards that you'd find in ships at that period. However, they are still limited to essentially visual and telescope-aided spotting, the same as those ships, because the rangefinder hasn't been invented yet, and definitely the fire control computer hasn't been. So assuming that they're targeting a moving fleet as opposed to an invasion fleet that's largely static, I would estimate you're probably looking at maybe 2,500 to 3,500 yards truly effective range. as in there is a chance of you hitting something that is beyond just roll the dice and statistically hope that eventually with enough shots something will land. Because, yeah, in theory you could hit up to 8,000 yards, but with a mostly manually aimed and completely manually sighted gun in the, well, mid to late 1800s, the chance of you actually hitting something at 8,000 yards that you were aiming at is very, very minimal. So, yeah, somewhere around 4,000 yards would be, I think, where you'd start to see results that were better as a result of your sighting than we just fired randomly at this elevation and hoped for the best. And yes, I am aware that in that time period, field artillery was capable of hitting other field targets at longer ranges than that, but that's because their target wasn't moving either. Whereas in a coastal defence scenario, in theory at least, your target is moving. Maximum Tillman IV asks, following your suggestion on how to modify Bismarck to be more efficient, how would you maximise Kentucky and Illinois? Well, this is a difficult one because, of course, this is exactly what the US Navy struggled with when it came to would they or wouldn't they complete Illinois and Kentucky, and they ended up not doing so. Fundamentally, the problem is that if you're going to significantly change the outfit of Kentucky and Illinois away from what the Iowas themselves are equipped with, you're basically going down one of two routes. You are either going full missile, and that's in a period that I don't really touch, and, well, the US Navy looked at how they could possibly do that anyway, or you're creating the most optimized gun-based battleship in an era when gun-based battleships were largely being seen as somewhat obsolete. And within that, you've also got a number of other questions. For example, obviously, a battleship is configured ideally to fight other battleships, but that precludes the notion of your enemy not having any battleships. The whole idea of battleships is to fight the enemy's capital ships, but in a post-World War II environment where the Russians don't have any battleships aside from a handful of World War I hang-ons, is the most optimal battleship one that is the most capable of dealing with an enemy capital ship, or is it something like the 8-inch rapid-fire armed versions that the US Navy considered, which is much more configured to the anti-aircraft threat, which is the actual real threat post-World War II. And let's face it, a bunch of quadruple 8-inch 55 autoloaders could also deal with Sverdlovs and various cruisers that the Soviets did end up actually building very, very easily. But if you wanted to do a sort of do minimum and make an ideal gun-based version of Illinois and Kentucky for dealing with post-1945 surface threats in the Cold War, then bearing in mind what the Soviets historically built, as opposed to if they had completed the Stalingrads or whatever, my instinct would be, if you wanted to do something particularly radical, strip off all the 5-inch 38s and the super-firing 16-inch turret, the Turret 2, and at the lower level, replace them with the new 5-inch 54, and have a twin 5-inch 54 in place of Turret 2, so you've got broadside firing on either side, and replace the upper 5-inch 38 mounts and, wherever possible, all your big 40mm Bofors mounts with 3-inch twin automatic firing guns. And you might end up with a triple stack forward where you'd have your triple 16, then a twin 5-inch 54, then perhaps a twin 3-inch, all in a nice row. And then the magazine space that would have supplied Turret 2 would hold the absolutely insane number of 5-inch and 3-inch rounds that you need for all these other mounts. Well, hold some of them at least. And the idea around that would be, well, 6 16-inch 50 caliber guns is still more than enough to deal with Sverdlovs and various other bits and pieces of the Cold War Soviet Navy. By weight saving, by removing Turret 2 and its associated paraphernalia, you're enabling a lot more weight to be put into sensors like radar and various anti-aircraft fire control systems, which you're going to need going forward, especially for your massive anti-aircraft battery. And now you have an absolutely colossal anti-aircraft battery Yes, I'm slightly minimising the number of long-range anti-aircraft guns, but that's because obviously they are longer range and more accurate and faster firing. But I'm also supplying an absolutely monstrous number of rapid-fire 3-inch, which would provide an absolute blanket of steel at ranges that, for most of the ship's projected service life, enemy aircraft are still going to have to fly in, and also make rather nice pull-off and drop-on points for short-range surface-to-air missiles if you want to later on. Mon Squire asks, many admirals were given positions above their capabilities, such as Beatty at Jutland or Gormley in the South Pacific. Can you pick admirals that, in your opinion, were out of their depth in their assignments, but perhaps would have given a much better showing if they were put in another area to lead, such as perhaps Beatty being deployed in the Mediterranean as opposed to Jutland, or Gormley staying in London, etc.? Well, assuming you have to keep them at Admiral's rank, I personally would not have ever put Beatty in charge of anything. I think he makes a very aggressive and capable subordinate, but he really doesn't have any business being the final arbiter in decision-making for any significant size formation, whether it be the Battlecruiser fleet or the Grand Fleet. I think Beatty would have been far better off, if he is to stay at an admiral's rank, of either being a rear or vice admiral in charge of a squadron under the command of somebody else. So perhaps put him in charge of one of the battlecruiser squadrons, put Sturdy in charge of the battlecruiser fleet, or put Beatty in charge of one of the battle squadrons of the Grand Fleet under Jellicoe. And likewise at the Battle of Trafalgar, switch Admirals Villeneuve and Magon around. Put Magon in charge of the French fleet, have Villeneuve as a subordinate commander. If anything, actually, get Villeneuve to replace Dumanoir, put Dumanoir where Magon was and put Magon where Villeneuve was, because then Dumanoir has no choice but to fight because he's stuck in the middle of the action. Villeneuve, for all his faults, will probably make a slightly better show of trying to turn around and assist than Dumanoir did. And, of course, Magon in place of Villeneuve will fight the entire fleet to the absolute last breath. And for a final quick example, I think perhaps Admiral Callahan, who would obviously lead the action against Hie and Hiroshima, etc., I think he would have been much better placed as the commander of cruisers on perhaps one of the escort forces for the carriers, or protecting the landing forces directly, something like that, something that would have given him an opportunity to learn more about the current state of modern naval warfare, rather than essentially just rolling up from the US, essentially combat inexperienced, and then being shoved into command of a major night action. Chief Eyeroll asks, watching another channel, I was struck by the cost of initial kit for a junior officer of the British Army at the start of World War I, even for the non-guards regiments. I recall that a midshipman in the Age of Sail had a list of uniforms and equipment that they were required to report with in their sea chest, but I don't remember the specifics for lieutenants. Could you briefly go over the required uniforms and kit for lieutenants and midshipmen, roughly comparing junior officer outfitting costs to equivalent ranks in the British Army during Nelson's time? So theoretically, midshipmen and lieutenants had to have, in the time period of Nelson, a dress uniform and an undress uniform, and technically that was it. But of course, you'd probably want more than one undress uniform, and you might want some work clothes, especially if you're a midshipman, perhaps also if you're a lieutenant, because you might not want to be in uniform 24/7, but nonetheless, exactly how much these things cost is a little bit of a moving target, unfortunately. It's even more so in the army, where famously in the British Army during Nelson's time, quite often, unless you were a relatively senior officer, you really needed either a separate source of income, a personal fortune, or some very generous benefactors in order to actually have a properly made up uniform, because there was no way your pay was ever going to cut it. And to a certain extent, that was also true in the Nelsonian Navy. So midshipmen, for example, essentially their pay, £2 to £3 a month. you'd be talking about maybe 3 or 4 months' pay to outfit yourself with at least a uniform set as a minimum. And of course, that's not taking account of wear and tear and having to replace the bits and pieces and so forth. So midshipmen usually needed an allowance from ashore as well to ensure that they stayed in kit. Lieutenants, of course, got paid slightly more, usually £8 to £9 a month, but commensurately the fanciness of their uniforms went up. On a lieutenant's pay, it was in theory possible to get yourself a half-decent uniform on 2 to 3 months' pay, as in a uniform set. But more realistically, if you're going to have, let's say, a change of undress uniform plus your dress uniform, you're still looking at probably total startup outfit costs of £30 to £40. But again, that's going to vary quite significantly depending on where you're getting the material from, because at times the Royal Navy would issue you with a bolt of cloth and say, right, that's what you've got as a base for your uniform. Other times they wouldn't. And where do you go to get it? Are you going to go to a tailor and get a tailor to make it all up bespoke for you? And are you going to go to a good tailor who's going to charge a lot? Are you going to go to a less expensive tailor who's going to charge less? Whereabouts in the country you are might make a difference. Are you going to perhaps have your family make some or all of it for you? All of this is going to affect the overall cost. So if, let's say, you were a lieutenant with a background of a fairly important family, a relatively large family, and they're very enthusiastic about you going into the Navy, your family might provide all the materials you need, and either your sisters or your mother or your household servants might do pretty much all of the tailoring and stitching for you, at which point the actual cost to you as a lieutenant is relatively minimal, but the quality of the materials might be such that might be £60 to £80 worth of material that's gone into your rather fancy set of uniforms. Conversely, if you don't really have much connection ashore and you're having to go to a local tailor, well, if you go to a relatively cheap tailor with some relatively cheap materials, basically the minimum you need to pass muster, and you're just getting your 1 dress and 2 undress uniforms, you might be able to pull that off for £25, which, to be fair, is still 2.5 months' pay, but, well, if you've spent a couple of years at sea, you might not have needed to spend all that much, and hopefully you've saved up a bit. Scott Jennings asks, in business there's the concept of the Peter principle, where people who are competent at their job will get promoted until they reach a point where they're no longer competent at their job, resulting in an organisation staffed mostly by people incompetent at their jobs. While I realise requirements for promotion are different in a military organisation like a Navy, has there ever been a Navy during the period the channel covers that suffered from an issue similar to the Peter principle? Yes, at times, especially during the Age of Sail, pretty much all of them. Obviously, during war, there's a bit of a turnover and a bit more emphasis on whether or not you can actually command properly, as well as a bit of a meritocracy going on. But for pretty much every Navy, whether it be British, Spanish, French, American, Russian, Austrian, etc., especially during times of peace in the Age of Sail, you would end up with promotion almost entirely by seniority. So if somebody above you died, well, then you got moved up a rank, depending on your level of seniority, and that was pretty much it. And people couldn't really be fired in the way that they can be today. You couldn't just turn around and say, oh, well, you know what, we don't need quite as many people as before, so sorry, you have to go find another job. Pretty much the only ways to leave the Navy were either voluntarily, resigning, or if you were court-martialed and found guilty of some kind of significant offence that could see you dismissed. In theory, you could obviously be encouraged to retire on your own, but given that being in the Navy, even on half pay, was a decent regular source of income, and in peacetime you're probably on half pay ashore, why would you ever do that? And there weren't technically any laws that prevented you from having a second job while you were on half pay. In fact, that was the whole point of half pay, to give you just enough to keep yourself going, but you were supposed to, find gainful employment otherwise. And so, simply because people got promoted on the basis of how long they'd been in the Navy rather than any particular capability, you could quite often end up, when a war kicked off, with a bunch of admirals who were either too old to really serve at sea, or potentially didn't actually understand how to run a war at an admiralty level, and similarly a bunch of captains who had been promoted to captain while on half pay, but perhaps, or had just sat as captains on half pay for years, but perhaps had no recent experience or possibly even no experience in commanding a major warship in battle. Jesus Hinojosa asks, I was reading about some of the causes of the Spithead mutiny, and one of the reasons given was the purser's pound. What was that, and how did the Royal Navy pursers keep the ship supplied, especially on long voyages, both before and after the purser's pound's abolition? The purser's pound was so called because a pound in weight is supposed to be 16 ounces, but pursers were in the habit of issuing a pound notionally, i.e. actually a 14-ounce ration to various sailors. And this was down to the way that pursers worked in the Royal Navy at the time. The purser wasn't actually paid. In fact, to become a purser, you had to pay the Navy. You had to buy your commission, a bit like you would in the Army, and you had to lodge a bond with the Navy, which was quite substantial, a couple of £1,000 usually. Then, once you're appointed to your position, you're essentially a middleman broker. In theory, a purser was supposed to make money by supplying non-essential goods to the crew. He was supposed to also be in charge of issuing things like food and potentially clothing and so forth, but that was notionally to be deducted from the crew's wages. So the crew might be paid a certain amount, there'd be a deduction for food, and the purser, calculating roughly how long they'd be on a voyage and therefore how much would be deducted from the crew for food, would then go out with a number in mind on credit and go to the various suppliers of food and other things to the Navy and spend up to about that amount of in credit, in theory, get those stores aboard the ship, and then everybody would be issued their rations of food, and the purser would know, okay, well, I've given this person his ration of food for 420 days, let's say, therefore 420 deductions from his wages, therefore when we get back the Navy owes me this amount. And hopefully, at the end of it, the two sums would balance up, so he'd pay off the credit that he'd incurred purchasing the stuff in the first place, and as I said, his profit would come from purchasing things like tobacco or other such non-essential goods, which he would then sell directly at a profit to the crew, although, again, that would be in the form of noting what he'd given to the crew and deducting from their wages, and then he'd make an accounting to the Admiralty. But the Admiralty also made an allowance in terms of how much food and other supplies you brought aboard compared to how much you issued to the crew, that there might be some bad food. So some might rot, you might be shortchanged by your supplier, etc. So they allowed 1/8 in wastage. But of course, this was supposed to be a notional thing. If you ended up with dodgy or missold food, they weren't going to penalise you for that. But what pursers tended to do was just go, okay, well, I'm allowed 1/8 in wastage. I'm always going to take 1/8 in wastage, and then either charge the crew for the full 16-ounce pound in deductions from their wages for their rations and pocket the difference. So you buy food at 14 ounces to the pound, issue it at 14 ounces to the pound, but charge it at 16 ounces to the crew. Or alternatively, buy it for 16 ounces to the pound, have it at 16 ounces to the pound, but issue it at 14 ounces to the pound, and then that remaining 2 ounces to the pound partly would feed yourself, and partly you could offer that as supplementary food for sale to hungry sailors. And this, of course, among other things, led to abuse of the purser system, because if the purser was allowed to charge X amount per pound of food that he'd issued to the crew, well, a purser who's particularly greedy might go, okay, well, I'm going to find the cheapest, dodgiest, most discounted food ashore and buy that, because the cost difference between that and what I'm charging is going to be much greater than if I actually buy half-decent food. Which was why pursers very often were not very popular, although certain pursers could be very popular if they actually issued something close to decent food at roughly the correct amount of weight. Before the establishment of ships' pursers, you were pretty much looking at voyages that didn't take too long, so food would just be loaded up and consumed kind of on an ad hoc basis. They'd be just a fixed price. We're going on a voyage to France with King Henry V. We're going to be at sea for 3 days. All right, everyone, bring 3 days of food with you. That was pretty much it. Once the purser's pound and various other things were abolished, pursers were just paid a flat rate, the same as everybody else. And obviously they didn't need to buy their way into the Navy at that point. Class A Cornate asks, aside from Admiral King becoming mildly irritated about the Mark 14 torpedo, are there any more legendary naval dressings down? Well, the wonderful thing about the really ultimate naval dressings downs is that in the vast, vast, vast majority of cases, what's actually said is not recorded because it's considered too salacious to let alone anyone else read. So, for example, when the commander of the Spanish galleasses during the Spanish Armada fails to press the attack against the English flagship, the Triumph, and lets it go away on a technicality, all you're left with in the record is that the Duke of Medina Sidonia sends over a messenger boat with, to quote the record, a man on board to say words to the captain that were not to his honour, which is an incredibly delicate way of... how angry do you have to be to watch, one of your second-in-commands doing such a terrible job that you summon one of your aides, get a boat in the middle of, bear in mind, of a combat situation and say, right, you're going to go over there and you're going to find the commander of the galleasses, and this is not to give him new orders on what to do. This is not to transmit particular messages from me about what we're going to do in the future. I want you purely to go over there and insult this man's honour as viciously as humanly possible. That was the level of annoyance Medina Sidonia was at. That would have been an interesting one to hear, to say the least. Admiral Duncan is at one point reputed to have picked a man up by his throat, held him over the side of the ship, and said certain things to him which the man had no choice at that point but to agree with. And, for it to escalate to that level of dispute in a naval situation, somebody's very, very angry. And, of course, you also have in the middle of Admiral Spruance's command during the latter stages of the war with Japan, as related in the biography series I'm doing on him, you have that one army general who showed up and started grandstanding, and then had the misfortune to run into Kelly Turner. When a fairly hardened army general is lambasted to such an extent that he doesn't even try to reply, he just leaves. Yeah, given that Turner was already a pretty volatile man, that tells you just exactly how bad that dressing down was. Jeffrey Conley asks, I recently saw the S584-02 for preliminary design plan for a battlecruiser dated October 12, 1912. My question is, how would this ship compare to the other battlecruisers of the time if the US Navy had actually gotten permission to build it? And what is your opinion on it compared to the Lexington class? This ship occupies a bit of a weird position, because although obviously, as you can see, it is dated late October 1912, given that this is a sketch design, to get fully proposed design drawings and get the thing actually keel laid, even if you worked really, really fast, you're talking about at least a year. So you're talking about a ship that's probably, if it was developed from this, going to be ordered and laid down in late 1913, possibly 1914, which of course means it would be the next generation beyond Der Flinger, Congo, and Tiger, which were the latest battlecruisers in the three other respective major navies. And there is no direct equivalent to it because, of course, there wasn't a successor to the Congos for the Japanese. The British eventually would build the Admiral class, but after a prolonged break, and that would be kind of the one beyond even this. I suppose you might compare the renowns, but they're a bit of a rush job. About the closest I think you'd probably get would be the Mackinsons. Now, looking at the ship just objectively speaking, What is its capability, considering we're talking about, let's say, 1913, 1914 design? 29 knots, that's pretty good. That would make it the fastest of the battle cruisers at the time. 8 14-inch guns, not a bad armament at all. That would actually make it the most heavily armed, because the Germans are still carrying 12-inch on their battle cruisers. It's the same as the Congos, and the British are still using 13.5-inch. So the fact that it also carries 8 submerged torpedo tubes as well as 16 6-inch guns makes it just a little bit more heavily armed than the Congos. So it's the fastest, it's just about the most heavily armed. What you can't see in the picture that I'm showing you on screen, but you can see in the full plan, is that its planned range is 8,000 miles at 10 knots. That makes it the longest ranged battlecruiser by a considerable margin. Armour-wise, it's got a 10-inch thick belt, thinning down to 7 inches. The barbettes are 9 inches thick, 3-inch thick deck. The turrets are 11 or 12 inches thick, depending on which you're looking at, but it seems that most of it is 11 inches. So protection-wise, it's better protected than the Congos, a little bit better protected than Tiger. In terms of maximum thickness, not quite as well protected as Der Flinger, albeit when you look at the extent of the armour, which you can see the overall armour scheme size, it's potentially got a considerably more coverage than Der Flinger. Although there is a bit of a weird contradiction in that the type of engines are given as turbine, which could indicate conventional propulsion, but if you look just aft of the funnel, you'll notice that you have boilers underneath the funnels, obviously, but then you have machinery and DYN, presumably dynamo, as 2 separate compartments, which possibly suggest a turboelectric drive ship. So overall, it's from an objective perspective, it's generally an advance on Tiger, Congo, and Der Flinger. As I said, it's marginally less well protected than the German ship, but considerably more heavily armed and faster, and it is better protected as well as faster, and as well, if not or slightly better armed than the Japanese and British ships. So from purely that perspective, it's good. From a broader perspective, however, I think this design is a little bit flawed and would probably need a lot of reworking before it could actually be used in practice. And that's for basically dimensional reasons. You can see the length of the waterline is listed as 920 feet. This thing is monstrously long, and that goes with a normal displacement of 42,250 tons. So no wonder this thing is a little bit better than all the other ships we just mentioned. It weighs, 8 to 10,000 tons more than they do. I mean, this thing is actually longer than a Lexington-class battlecruiser, and HMS Hood for that matter. Now, I have a feeling this may be something to do with the state of US boiler technology at the time, which was a historic problem when they were looking at the first iterations of the Lexington design as well. And the fact they seem to have gone for 79.3% of the waterline having some form of armour on it. And the fact it has to fit so much fuel to get that ridiculous range probably has something to do with it as well. But I have a feeling that if this design was taken forward, it would need some revision, bringing the size down quite a bit to have those kind of capabilities on a hull that actually made sense from an efficiency perspective. Because essentially, as I said, it's a powerful design for the period, but not a very efficient one. And, I mean, as I say, it's bigger than a Lexington and less capable. Albeit, to be fair, it is actually somewhat better protected than a Lexington, despite being slightly less well-armed and somewhat slower. Texas and LaShock asks, in the vein of HMS New Zealand at Jutland, can you think of any other instances of seemingly successfully invoking divine or supernatural protection for a warship? Well, you have things like HMS Warspite's entire career. I mean, it didn't necessarily stop her from getting damaged, but it did stop her from getting sunk. The Battle of Narvik, what I would call the third Battle of Narvik, certainly would qualify for that, because if, in principle, by all naval strategy, sending a battleship into confined waters with a bunch of enemy destroyers who are essentially rats backed into a corner and are heavily armed with torpedoes is the very definition of how to lose a capital ship, plus there's a bunch of U-boats there, And we know now that a bunch of U-boats did actually fire on Warspite with their various torpedoes. And as it turns out, between malfunctioning magnetic detonators, an incredibly accomplished spotter aircraft, and the fact that you unleashed a pack of tribal glass ahead of her, Warspite sailed through the entire thing with nary a scratch on her. And as you'll see in a video coming up in the next month or so, Admiral Hawke's flagship at the Battle of Quiberon Bay at one point takes on 13 enemy ships of the line. The British formation behind him basically thinks, oh, that's it, he's absolutely dead. There's no way even a first rate is surviving that encounter. And Hawke emerges with his ship having barely a scratch. I mean, the damage report is like 2 paragraphs, most of which is bits of rigging. And actually, while we're in the age of sail, HMS Africa at the Battle of Trafalgar. She fights basically a third of the entire enemy fleet in succession, including, of course, Santissima Trinidad. And bearing in mind, Dumanoir's Vanguard literally has nothing other to do than to shoot at Africa. And not only does Africa survive the experience, of the British ships heavily engaged at Trafalgar, she pretty much has the lowest casualty count. The only ships that have a lower casualty count than her are the British ships that are further back in the various British columns. So, for example, in Collingwood's column, you have to get all the way back to the Polyphemus, which is about 10th in Collingwood's line before you get a lower casualty figure in terms of percent of crew. And while you only have to go back to the Leviathan, which is 4th in the line in Nelson's column, that's kind of offset by the fact that Victory and Temeraire take quite the pounding. And of course, Neptune is a 3-decker, Leviathan's a 2-decker, they're second rate and third rate, whereas poor old Africa is a really small 64-gunner. John McDonough asks, I've been listening to you describe your work and research methodologies in the past few dry docks. It put in my mind that there was a 5-minute guide to warships before you in pocket-sized book form. Are you familiar with the Navies of the Second World War series published by Doubleday in the late 1960s? And if so, what is your evaluation of their content in general? I know the volumes on the Soviet and Japanese navies were a little bit skimpy, but I'm sure they did their best with what information was available. Yes, well, the series was written by, of course, T Lenton, that's Henry Trevor Lenton, and he was a Royal Navy officer. He served in the Second World War and then went on to be a notable historian later on, once he retired from the Merchant Navy in the middle of the Cold War. Now, of course, as you mentioned, some of the little series of books that he published were a bit thin on the ground, but even with the ones he published on Allied ships, like you can see here, this one on American battleships, carriers and cruisers, obviously, being a product of the 60s and 70s, there are going to be a few inaccuracies here and there, either because certain things were still classified that have now been declassified, more information has been found, like, you know, how many torpedoes actually hit Prince of Wales and why was it there in the first place, and so on and so forth. But broadly speaking, they're still pretty good little pocket references. Most of the overall details are correct, of course, with the exception of things like, as we said, with some of the Soviet stuff and such like, where that information just it wasn't available, and even these days is rarely available in the English language. Only a few decent books about that subject have been published. So, for their time, they're very, very good. And of course, if you want to see most of them, not all, but most of them collected together, he, towards the end of his publishing career, did actually publish British Empire and Commonwealth Warships of the Second World War, which is a phone book size compendium, which is essentially everything from battleships all the way down to the smallest of fishing trawlers brought into naval service. And as you pretty much say, a lot of those descriptions are very much like for the 5-minute guides. You know, they're page and a half of text describing where the ship came from, why it was developed, and roughly how capable it was going into its career. So I rather like them as a short reference, and I would say they're about 95% accurate still, which is a pretty good hit rate. But some of the finer details, as mentioned, simply modern scholarship and declassification of documents have surpassed a few bits and pieces, which is no reflection on Mr. Lenton, because there's nothing really he could have done about that. Nathapron Hong Sharon asks, for a hypothetical British invasion after Germany won the war against both France and Russia, could the Royal Navy actually destroy German supply ships and anti-submarine vessels if they were protected by a now stronger than ever Luftwaffe? If the distance is longer like the Korean Strait, then maybe you need a big navy to invade, but the English Channel seems narrow enough to be controlled by air. I mean, to be perfectly honest, even if the Germans somehow beat the Russians and, of course, have occupied the entirety of France, to pull off anything like a successful Operation Sealion, I think you'd be more wanting to focus on minor details like making sure at least 50% of your invasion fleet actually has, minor things like engines. When I cover Operation Sealion, that's going to be a big bone of contention. But nonetheless, if we assume, for the sake of argument, that this hypothetical Germany has managed to get a toehold in mainland Britain and is trying to supply it, yes, the Royal Navy could still destroy the German supply vessels for two main reasons. Firstly, weather. Germany doesn't have much at all in the way of a night-capable escort and strike force in terms of seaborne warfare. Hitting London in the Blitz is a slightly different matter, but in any case. And that means that Royal Navy submarines and the faster ships can get down and wreak havoc on both supply beachheads, supply ships, and supply ports during the hours of darkness. On top of that, related to, is weather. So extremely bad weather, storms, low cloud cover, fog, etc. All of those, also things the Luftwaffe can't really operate in, and therefore provide cover for the Royal Navy. And you might be thinking, well, surely if they know that, then the Germans just won't sail during those time periods. The problem is, while the Royal Navy can, to a certain extent, pick and choose what weather conditions it sails down into the Channel to attack the German supply ships in, the Germans can't choose whether or not they want to send supply convoys over, because if they do have a foothold in mainland Britain, they're going to have to be fighting for it pretty much constantly, which means they're going to be using up supplies pretty much constantly, which means they are going to need constant resupply. And if the weather forecast says, well, actually you're now going to get, 2-3 days of torrential storms and really high seas, followed by a couple of days of really thick fog, so pretty much the best part of a week, well, the Luftwaffe ain't operating during that time, but you can't leave an army fighting for its beachhead for a week without supplies. You have to try and get those supplies over, and that's the perfect time for the Royal Navy to strike. So essentially you'd be, even with an arbitrarily strong Luftwaffe, you'd need to have weeks of good weather. I mean, even with a massively, massively stronger Navy and a massively stronger Air Force and artificial harbours, look at how much damage one major storm did to Allied efforts in the aftermath of the D-Day landings. And the other big issue, of course, is that if there are German landings and they have a foothold, it does change the way the British are going to be operating their armed forces, because historically you have various air groups in Britain scattered all over the place. Obviously 11 Group taking most of the fighting in the Battle of Britain, but if there's an invasion, then pretty much every operational British aircraft, wherever it is in the British Isles, is going to be focused on destroying that. And while the Luftwaffe may be stronger than ever if it can direct the bulk of its resources at going across the Channel, if there is a specific need, big German supply convoy known to be coming in, and the Royal Navy absolutely needs to destroy it, but perhaps the weather for once is in the Germans' favour, then the RAF will most likely still have enough fighters to contest air supremacy or gain air supremacy, at least for a short while, in the skies over the Channel to let the Royal Navy do its thing. And to be perfectly honest, even though the Channel is not the widest of sea-water passageways, a supply convoy can't really do a there, unload and back in a day in daylight hours, so there are always going to be points where it's sailing where it's going to be vulnerable. Primark 359 asks, what were the Americanized potential Nelson-class refits mentioned in Drydock 330, and what made them particularly American in character? The vast majority of Nelson-class refits drawn up during World War II were, of course, based around British technology, so they went back and forth between 4.5-inch pancake mounts and 5.25-inch mounts as per the King George V's, with occasional diversions off into maybe just using twin fours as an emergency. Of course, none of these really got put through. The Americanized ones, however, and there's a wind tunnel model of one of them here, essentially looked at two major potential refits, and it's entirely to do with the anti-aircraft battery. One used the new 5-inch 54 and proposed to have 3 twin mounts per side. The other one, although it's a little bit difficult to see here, but if you look around the area of the mainmast just behind the funnel, you can probably just about see, was to replace the entirety of the secondary battery and anti-aircraft battery with what was at that point standard American weaponry. So all of the pom-poms and orlikins, etc., would go in favour of 40mm Bofors, and the 4.7-inch and 6-inch mounts would be taken out. And instead, again, hopefully as you can see, there would be a nest of 4 twin 5-inch 38 mounts either side of the ship. So you'd basically have 2 superfiring pairs and then have them back to back, which would give the ship obviously 2 less gun mounts than American fast battleship, unless you happen to be the USS South Dakota, but would also give it a very extensive 40mm Bofors battery, and on top of that, of course, to go with all the Americanized anti-aircraft and secondary battery weapons would be American anti-aircraft fire control systems, American radar rangefinders, etc. So essentially the entire secondary and anti-aircraft battery would be fully American, and the only armament-wise elements of the Nelson at that point would be the main battery, the 16-inch up front, and of course the underwater torpedo tubes. In the end, it turned out to not be possible to persuade the Americans to refit yet another battleship on behalf of the Allies. I think probably Richelieu had scared them off by that point. Sam Signorelli asks, in Drydock 304 you explained the difference in rudder positions like standard and full. What about meet her and hard over? For example, hard over would seem to imply turning the rudder all the way into the stops, but you said that wasn't done due to the risk of jamming the rudder. Well, as I explained in a similar recent Drydock question, hard over, yes, that you would put the rudder all the way into the stops at that point, and normally you would not do this because of the risk of jamming, but at some point the risk of damage to the ship, major damage from torpedo strike or bombs or whatever, becomes a significantly greater likely factor than the potential of jamming the rudders, and therefore essentially what you're doing is a very quick cost-benefit analysis and concluding that the overall risk of jamming the ship's rudders is a easier risk to sustain than the risk of having a good chunk of your ship blown out from under you. Or in more mundane terms, perhaps, if somebody sees a rock or an unexpected shoal or something right ahead, then hard over is a preferable position because whatever happens with the rudders, whether they jam or not, that's still better than smacking into a permanent part of the landscape. So hard over could be used, but would be relatively rarely used and only in times of extreme crisis, which incidentally is why it's not uncommon when you read about ships in, let's say, World War II undertaking a series of particularly violent maneuvers to dodge bombs, shells, torpedoes, etc. You will, on a not irregular basis, see that at some point during those maneuvers the ship's rudder jams, or they have steering problems shortly thereafter, precisely because of what's happened by putting those rudders hard over potentially multiple times. The rudder position meet her is to do with when the ship is maneuvering, because obviously if you maneuver a ship, so you want the ship, say, to turn to port, you put the rudder over, let's say, 20 degrees to port, the ship starts to swing, you straighten up the rudder, but the ship now has inertia, rotational inertia, so it's going to keep going until the water slows it down. So the rudder call for meet her is essentially saying, right, the ship is approaching the course we actually want it to be on, but its speed of rotation is clearly going to take it past that. So now you have to put the rudder over to provide a counterbalancing force, which hopefully will stop the ship's rotation on or approximately on the bearing that you actually want the ship to be on. So essentially it's counter steer. Michael Gilson asks, the Independence class had an inherent list that had to be controlled by trimming, which could be difficult to do when the ships were either fully loaded or suffering from battle damage. Could this have been prevented by building them with a deck edge elevator opposite the island instead of on the centre line? And would this have delayed construction, since the whole point of the class wasn't to be the best fast flight decks, but the fast flight decks that could be built fastest? Unfortunately, I don't think putting a deck edge elevator in the Independence class would really have helped all that much in terms of correcting the list. And that's mostly because when you look at the size of the blister that was put in versus the amount of ballast that had to be put in before that in the initial conversion proposal, you're talking in the order of 300 to 400 tons of weight being shifted. And yeah, okay, it would be higher up and therefore exerting more of a moment of force, but no deck edge elevator is going to provide a effective 350 ton effect counterbalance for the ship's list. It will provide a small amount, but nowhere near enough. Plus, as it turned out, the installation of the blister that they used was actually quite helpful because it let them stick several hundred tons more fuel in compared to a Cleveland class, which gave the Independence class a little bit more range to play with as well. But in overall terms, building the ships with a deck edge elevator instead of a centerline one, it could have been done. It would have delayed the construction a little bit because, of course, at the time the Independence class were being developed, deck edge elevators were a bit of a new technology, whereas everybody understood centerline elevators pretty well. And it would have required a little bit more complexity to the design rather than put all the elevator stuff on the centerline and put a box hanger on around them and job's done. So it potentially would have delayed the ships coming into service a little bit, but not by all that much, I would have thought, if it was from the very beginning. Glenn Ricafrente asks, it's time. Please tell us the story about how the British finagled an airbase on the Azores from the Portuguese in World War II. Well, I'm afraid I'm going to have to keep you on ice on that one for just a little bit longer, because I have drawn up plans for a full video on that subject, but that is going to come hopefully in the next 2 to 3 months. For some bizarre reason, it works out time-wise slightly better to fly to the Azores and then back again via Portugal than it is to go Portugal first and then the Azores, which means I'll have to technically film everything slightly out of sequence, but that's just a matter of placing videos within the editing software, because what I'm planning to do is visit the battle site from the medieval period, which kicks everything off in Portugal, and then also go over to the Azores to see, well, this particular airfield, to, as it is now, to show you where everything took place. And don't worry, it's not being far too extravagant, because thanks to relatively cheap flights in and around Europe, I think the total cost of the flights is about £70 or £80, and maybe a little bit more for the hotel stays and so forth. But outside of a little bit of car hire and couple of overnights in a hotel, I'll be able to tell you the full story, and it will be literally on site. Tim Jacobs asks, in the December 2024 issue of Warship International, there's an article by Mr. Brian Perry titled USS Yorktown Battle Damage Setting the Record Straight, and he specifically refers to this channel and my response to a question in Drydock 268 concerning the alleged propulsion issues that Yorktown had at Midway. After reading his article, has the evidence he presented changed your mind on the subject? And if so, or if not, why? Yeah, this is actually a very interesting one, because Mr. Perry and I had a very cordial and beneficial exchange of emails last year in the run-up to his putting the article together, essentially with him asking me, why do I believe that Yorktown had issues with her engines, versus various bits of evidence he'd put together at that stage that seemed to indicate that perhaps she didn't. And At the time, obviously, me going off of various reports, both in decent books and primary sources like survivors' accounts, all of which said that they sailed off to Midway somewhat patched up after the damage at Coral Sea, but nowhere near patched up enough. And the original repair estimates of 3 months versus the 3 days that they had to repair the ship seemed to all track with this, because you might do some patchwork, but not everything. And it was a little bit of an impasse with the primary sources, because you have a bunch of people who are there saying, we weren't able to make full speed, but then as presented in the article, Mr. Perry had a bunch of battle damage data, both from Coral Sea and some repair data as well, showing that perhaps the boilers had been patched up and their component parts. But one of the other key elements was that in the log, it described Yorktown as heading up to maximum speed, obviously to evade incoming Japanese aircraft, but the maximum speed that was listed, although high, was not close to the maximum speed that she was actually capable of on paper in full fighting condition. And so to me, that seemed to indicate that while some repairs might have been done to the boilers in the 3 days she was in dry dock, perhaps not all repairs had been done. So perhaps either they couldn't run the boilers at full power, full pressure, or there was something else in there that was preventing them from reaching top speed. Now, to his credit, in the actual article, Mr. Perry goes on to cite a variety of other circumstances in which maximum speed is cited in various reports, and argues that this is indicating perhaps the maximum speed attained rather than the maximum speed possible. And if that were the case, then that would seem to indicate that, at least as far as dockyard repair sources and the ship's logs are concerned, Yorktown did sail into battle with absolutely everything fully operational. My personal conclusion is that, based on his research, or based on the article and the various exchanges of emails that we've had, I would say he's definitely proved that Yorktown was in a much better condition going into the Battle of Midway than heretofore perhaps has been thought by many. My only reservation in going behind the article wholesale would be that in Yorktown's battle report for Midway itself, as well as mentioning that when she's undamaged as of yet at Midway by Japanese bombers at the time, she gets up to a maximum speed of 30.5 knots. Later on, at about 1600, after it's taken some damage and a bunch of the boilers are offline, then they make the point that they are now steaming at maximum speed, which is pretty much the same wording they used earlier, 23 knots at 210 RPM. Now, to me at least, and of course opinions may vary, but that seems to indicate that when the report writer, at least in this case, is using maximum speed, which is used twice in the report, that this is perhaps reflecting the actual maximum speed that the ship is capable of at the time. So at 1600, after various bits of damage and some boilers going offline, it's capable of 23 knots at maximum speed, which would then infer that earlier on that the maximum speed is 30.5 knots, which would indicate something is not providing perhaps full power to the ship's screws at that point before, which would then obviously logically be something that's happened at Coral Sea, whether that be because the boilers can't be pushed beyond a certain point because there's a few systems that are offline or have been patched up and damaged, because although the reports don't specifically say that boilers were cracked and needed to be welded together, it does mention things like forced draft blower foundations being cracked and various supply pipes being cracked or having leaks, and perhaps those hadn't been fully addressed. So that would be the only reservation I would have. I still think there's a certain degree of evidence to indicate that perhaps, although Yorktown might be said to be about like 95% efficiency, but at this point you are pretty much down to subjective interpretation of certain statements in various sources. on the broader facts of the fairly significant repair job and the extent of the original damage, I would say Mr. Perry's article is absolutely spot on. Waldo739 asks, I just watched your video comparing torpedoes, and this question came up. In your professional opinion, do you think the Allies would have been a little stuffed if the Axis powers had access to an explosive of approximately the same power as Torpex, as 50% more bang would surely see a lot more Allied vessels on the bottom? Could this have changed the course of the war, or at least have lengthened it considerably? I mean, it undoubtedly would have led to slightly more Allied losses. I think it would have helped the Japanese out a little bit more than the Germans, though. Partly because if you substitute Torpex in for the hexanite-based stuff that the Germans had in their various torpedoes, while it obviously does increase the TNT equivalent, it still leaves you with a TNT equivalent warhead that, while considerable, is within the realms of reasonable survivability. I mean, okay, yeah, it would overwhelm anything bar a King George V torpedo defense system, but ultimately the vast majority of German torpedoes that actually hit anything were directed against merchant ships or small escorts, and outside of a few lucky cases where a slightly bigger boom probably wouldn't have made a huge difference, like hitting a completely empty tanker or something like that, the ships died for the most part anyway, so they would have also been sunk in this case, just slightly more vigorously. There are, of course, a few cases where warships were hit by German torpedoes and survived, but in some cases, like, say, HMS Eskimo, well, you can't have your bow more blown off than completely blown off, so that's really not going to probably change all that much. There might be a bit more shock and so forth, but realistically, most of the energy's been expended tearing the bow off. A few warships here and there perhaps might go down instead of surviving, but it's going to be a relatively small number. Whereas with the Japanese, as we saw, Japanese torpedoes already had some pretty hefty warheads behind them, even if they weren't the Long Lance, and ramping up their power by using Torpex instead pushes their TNT equivalent destructive capability into some truly scary areas. Now, of course, with something like Wasp, it's going to end up sunk anyway, but for ships that were hit but managed to recover back, like, say, Saratoga or North Carolina, or right at the end of the war, USS Pennsylvania, as you can see here, or indeed the ships that were recovered after the Pearl Harbor strikes, with that much more powerful explosion going off next to them, and bearing in mind it's not just the multiplier factor of Torpex, it's the fact you're starting off with a pretty hefty warhead, therefore 50% on top of, let's say, 1,200 pounds, as you found in some of the bigger Japanese torpedoes, that's a lot more equivalent booming increase than putting a 50% increase on a 600-pound warhead, because obviously you're talking about an increase in 600 pounds TNT equivalent as opposed to 300. And so those kind of ships, given how close North Carolina, for example, came to having their magazines breached, how many times Saratoga took hits and had to go back for extensive repairs, and so on and so forth, yeah, then I can see that potentially lengthening the Pacific War a little bit. Because, if more of the Pearl Harbor ships are not recoverable, that probably doesn't affect things for most of the Pacific War, but it will lead to a slightly greater shortage of bombardment of capable ships in the latter stages, which could lead to some invasions being slowed down a little. Now, would it overall affect how the war ends and how long it takes? Probably not, because the atom bombs are still going to go off, but you might see the Japanese leadership trying to hold out a little bit. It depends exactly on what their thinking is at that stage, because the atomic bombs and the potentially an impending Russian invasion are some pretty big indicators it might be time to throw in the towel. But the flip side to that, if through sequential small delays, perhaps the American forces aren't quite fully in occupation of Okinawa and Iwo Jima, etc., they might hold out a little bit longer, or indeed they might have ended up using the atomic bombs to clear the defenses of Iwo Jima or Okinawa. Who knows? So potential slight increase to the Pacific campaign, but maybe not all that much. Candor asks, while the communications technology of the time would probably have made it impractical in reality, between the two world wars, did anybody write any theoretical doctrine about using air attacks to support an ongoing battleship engagement? And if so, what did it look like? Now, I'm not entirely sure about the Japanese, although it wouldn't surprise me if they had, but most Japanese tactics for air assault seem to look at the carriers as a way of attritioning away the battle line before the grand battle. But when you look at US Navy fleet problems in the interwar period, you do see air attacks as part of a battle line engagement, with either the air attacks going in immediately before or immediately after to basically disrupt and cripple or finish off enemy ships. And occasionally you see attacks going in during an overall engagement as well, either as an attempt to break up the enemy line or to soften them up a bit for the ongoing battle. For the Royal Navy, I have a lot more information at hand, and they definitely did look at torpedo strikes during an ongoing battleship engagement. And in fact, in real life, in World War II, Ark Royal's pilots wanted to go in and attack Bismarck while King George V and Rodney were battering away at it, but were told to hang back. But in the interwar period, the idea of using airstrikes to help soften up and further damage an battle line during engagement absolutely was both written into theory and practiced tactically. So in the copies of the various Royal Navy fleet exercise documents I've got, some of which I turned into a video, you do see some examples of that occurring in some of the larger fleet scale engagements. That still occurs. And also thank you to Dr. Clark for providing me with a copy of his PhD thesis, because that looks into interwar British carrier doctrine in extreme detail. That is the entire subject of the thesis, and he documents there that this was an entire branch of Fleet Air Arm planned tactics to essentially launch either groups of 3 or groups of 6, usually torpedo bombers, and the idea there being that, as you note in the overall question, that anti-aircraft guns are fairly unlikely to be manned while the main engagement is going on, because being in an open exposed anti-aircraft gun meant when heavy shells are landing around you is a good way to get yourself killed. And Royal Navy aimed to exploit that by using small numbers of torpedo bombers per target vessel. And one of the tactics they envisaged was a basic pincer attack. So they effectively viewed a torpedo bomber attack of 3 aircraft being, okay. If the enemy ship is largely trying to hold course in a battle line and doesn't really have all that much in the way of anti-aircraft opposition for you, then they reckon 3 aircraft stood a fairly good chance of scoring a hit, or at least scaring it out of the battle line and disrupting the enemy formation. 6 was obviously better if you could manage it, but the idea of 6 would be to split into 2 formations of 3 and try and pincer an enemy ship to even more guarantee a hit at that stage. And sending more after a single enemy ship in a battle line was considered overkill. Now, that's not to say they would launch just 6 torpedo bombers. We're talking about 8 per target. So if the enemy line is, say, 4 battleships, then ideally you'd want 24 swordfish out there, 6 for each ship. And it was planned that these would attack, as I said, during battle in an attempt to further damage or cause initial damage to enemy ships. And these would primarily have been off of the armoured flight deck carriers, which would have been operating quite close to the battle line. So essentially, with swordfish acting as on-call fire support for the Royal Navy. And the thing is, at the end of the day, there were very, very few engagements between the Royal Navy and more than one capital ship, and the number of times the Royal Navy was in a position to have a multi-capital ship showdown with a carrier in attendance are even slimmer. So they were never able to really put this kind of idea into practice. But in theory, had the Italians been so inviting as to actually line up all their battleships in one go, which of course they were planning on doing in the very last stages of Italy's involvement in World War II, or had the Germans kept everybody back in Germany and sailed out with both Scharnhorst and both Bismarcks, you might very well have seen this kind of tactic used. Andrew Dederer asks, recently I saw a programme on Rorke's Drift that mentioned that more British officers died there than at Waterloo. Along the same lines, I remember something like 25% of all British officer casualties in the Revolutionary War happened at Bunker Hill. Clearly, peacetime, or recently stood up officer billets, were stuffed. Did the Royal Navy have a similar pattern? Just how many wartime officers were half-pay, reserve, or the like? And how many were pulled from the enlisted ranks? How did expansion and losses affect officering during wartime? During periods of significant war, like the Napoleonic Wars period, a good number of Royal Navy officers who were at sea would have previously been on half-pay or similar before the war started. And that's simply because the Royal Navy's policy during the bulk of the Age of Sail, and indeed to a certain extent before and after it, but especially in the Age of Sail, was to have huge numbers of ships in reserve, in ordinary, and of course those ships didn't need much in the way of manpower. And with, as we mentioned before, the fact that it was very difficult to actually get people to leave the Royal Navy, that would mean that you might have something like, say, the 7 Years' War cause a large number of Royal Navy officers to either be called back to the colours or to go up the ranks, etc., and there'd be ships to have them all on. But then when the war ends, then the number of ships in commission drops dramatically, number of officers that are needed drops dramatically, they will go off on half pay. But then when, say, the American War of Independence kicks off, and that snowballs into a massive global war, then everyone who's still alive goes back to the colours, and so on and so forth. And of course, the longer a war goes on, with the on-again, off-again, but mostly on-again nature of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, you'd have huge numbers of officers present as the Navy expands and expands and expands, and new officers are brought in to replace casualties through age, casualties through the occasional court-martial, and casualties through battle. And that, of course, means there's more chance for meritocratic rising through the ranks than the seniority-based system that would dominate in peacetime. So, unlike the army, where you might have quite a number of officers above and beyond what's necessary, in the Royal Navy, in peacetime or in just gone to war periods, you wouldn't typically expect to see much in the way of excess officerage in various ships as compared to otherwise, simply because the half-pay system existed, so any superfluous officers could be sent away. Now, you might have battles early on in the war where a ship might have many more officers than was necessary, but that would usually be because the ship was en route somewhere, taking a bunch of additional officers to supply the command crew for various other ships, presumably at or near the ship's destination, which were themselves being stood up and pulled out of reserves. Christopher Dooley asks, how, if at all, were design speeds for sailing warships calculated, and what sort of power could a full spread of sail be expected to generate? It was a mixture, because of course we're talking about pre-tank testing, in the Age of Sail. It would be a mixture of experience, i.e., we built this kind of ship with this much sail area and this hull form and achieve this speed. So if we repeat that ship, in theory, we should get something similar. Or if we build something reasonably similar and keep the proportions similar, it should be about the same speed. But if we want it to go faster, well, maybe we'll trim the hull line here, and here. Maybe make it a little bit longer or whatever, or add a bit more masts and rigging so we can fit a few more square meters of canvas, or square feet at that time, of canvas up there. So a little bit of trial and error, a little bit of experience, a little bit of rule of thumb. There were some general formulas for length versus breadth versus depth versus sail area and so forth. But a huge amount of it would be institutional knowledge, both in the form of the shipwrights themselves and in terms of ships models and so forth, which is why they were so precious. But expected speed would always be a little bit of a kind of, lick your finger, stick it in the air and hope to determine which way the wind was blowing, because some ships, for example, like frigates, might be superb under mild breezes, but in really heavy seas, a ship of the line would be faster than them. both because it has more mass to power through the waves and because, generally speaking, a ship of the line would have somewhat stouter masts and rigging and therefore could hold its sails longer in really high winds. And then, of course, you have things like trim and the fact that each one of these ships is essentially handcrafted. So two ships of ostensibly the same class, if one is out of trim and one is properly trimmed in terms of distribution of ballast and load, might make completely different top speeds. And even without that, even if all your trimming and everything was exactly the same, ships built in one yard versus ships built in another yard, even to exactly the same plans, one might be a little bit heavier, one might have slightly looser weave on the canvas for the sails, and so on and so forth. And so even within a class, you would have good sailors and bad sailors. And to a certain extent with that, you could also have tricks with handling that various captains would know, as well as redistribution of the trim, which could result in a ship that was usually held to be a bad sailor suddenly coming up a couple of knots faster than it could previously go, or a ship that was a really good sailor in the hands of a bad captain suddenly dropping a few knots of speed. So, to quote Pirates of the Caribbean, back in the Age of Sail, working out the top speed of what you expected a warship to do was more like a guideline, really. In terms of power produced, it's a little bit of a difficult one because, of course, sails don't produce directly any kind of measurable horsepower because they're not rotating a cylinder that can therefore be measured. But the force generated by sails is calculated by a formula which is 0.0034 multiplied by the sail area in square feet multiplied by the wind velocity squared. And then you multiply that by the ship's speed to give you a notional horsepower output. And so, of course, you can see that you have to work out how fast is the wind and how fast the ship is going in order to calculate the power produced. So, for example, if we said that in a 25-knot wind, Victory, HMS Victory that is, was achieving 11 knots, using somewhat arbitrary figures, we know that she has just over 6,500 square yards of combined sail surface area, which would suggest at 25 knots a force of 13,834 pounds. Or another rule of thumb would be that you're looking at roughly 1/5 of a horsepower per square foot based on a 5-knot wind, and as the wind speed doubles, horsepower increases to the power of 4. Which would suggest in a 5-knot wind that Victory's sails, which would be 58,600 square feet, would produce just under 12,000 horsepower. But I have a feeling that something might be off with those equations, at least when it applies to ships of the line. That may be predicated around more modern hull forms, simply because you're looking at them kicking out horsepower calculations, which are a little bit absurd considering that they're more than an order of magnitude higher than what you'd need to move a T1 tanker, for example, with a little bit more displacement than Victory has at 11 to 12 knots. I mean, yeah, okay, Victory's hull form is not as efficient as a T1 tanker, but it's not that inefficient, and that's only 5 knots of wind. And we know Victory needed a bit more than 5 knots of wind to get up to her full speed. Ash the Lego Guy asks, did ships of any size in World War II pick up their brass for any calibre of spent ammunition? In peacetime, you were absolutely supposed to recover any brass from cartridges that you'd fired, obviously more typically from anti-aircraft guns, quick-firing guns in the secondary battery, or occasionally, if you happen to be a Brooklyn-class cruiser, from your main armament, and if you were the Germans, from any armament whatsoever. But in wartime, most of this went out the window. In wartime, pretty much all the brass cartridges that were generated tended to get just chucked over the side, either during or immediately after the engagement. But this could vary somewhat. If it was clear that the ship was well and truly in the clear and not in danger anymore, well, brass is still a relatively valuable war resource. So if there was a ton of brass cartridges lying around on deck and pretty much a zero chance that you were going to be attacked anytime soon, then some ships would then pick up their brass and store them away for future use, whether immediately for other purposes or for returning to port when they got home for recycling. I Forget Why I'm Here asks, how did the Japanese and American styles of packing onto merchant ships differ, if at all? I know on the Allied side of the war there were issues of theft, items then being sold on the black market, etc., and all of this before the invention of the standard container. Did the Japanese have these issues? And if so, what effect did it have on the early war effort in China or America, specifically the early phase of the war when Japanese ships were still actually making it to their destinations? Packing cargo was packing cargo, to be perfectly honest. Before the invention of standardized containers, a lot of it would either just be on pallets or just in craneable or man-portable amounts, whether that be sacks, boxes, etc., etc. And that didn't vary hugely from place to place, especially by the World War II period, when international cargo shipping, and therefore roughly what you'd expect cargo to be packed in, if at all, was fairly standard. Things like bulk cargoes like coal or mineral ore would just be shoveled or bucketed wholesale into cargo holds, not really packed into anything particular. As a result, there obviously are accessible items. So yes, there would definitely have been a issue with Japanese merchant crew and potentially Navy and Army personnel pilfering some elements from merchant ships' cargoes, either in the form of something for direct benefit of themselves, like a bit of extra food, or for something they could sell on the black market. However, while black markets and so forth did exist in Japan, shall we say, control and punishment was just a little bit stricter. If you were caught, stealing a few tins of Spam or something on a Allied merchant ship, you might get docked pay, you might be put in the brig, you might have a disciplinary. In Japan, you might be beaten severely with sticks until you forgot that you were actually guilty of anything, and then wondering why people were beating you with sticks. And like it or not, that does serve as a little bit more of a deterrent, especially in a period of rationing. Let's face it, if you're an Allied sailor and you have family to feed at home, and let's face it, rations don't go too far, and let's say there's a crate of random supplies that are ration packs perhaps that are being sent out across the Atlantic heading for US troops, and one of those crates takes a bit of a battering at the edge of a cargo hold and splits and spills, the prospect of maybe getting in a little bit of trouble but potentially hoovering up 3 or 4 packs of rations and saying, well, I'm sorry, but some of them just vanished in all the pitching and the upheaval, maybe some of them gone down a hatchway or over the side of the deck or something, that's a fairly easy temptation to give into. Whereas in Japan, trying to grab a few extra handfuls of rice on the off chance that you won't be mercilessly beaten by a psychopathic senior officer, that there's a little bit more of a cost-benefit analysis going on there. Jim Smitty asks, following my reading of Blind Man's Bluff, it got me wondering about something. In the time period the channel covers, were submarines used for espionage in peacetime? Or was this seen as underhanded and a non-gentleman work and shouldn't be done in the time period that the channel covers? Certainly not really before World War I, because, well, at that point they were still having trouble making sure submarines came up again after they'd gone under, so heading over somewhere else to do spy work, not so much. In the run-up to World War II, however, submarine reconnaissance and espionage definitely was a thing. To what extent this was carried out, I'm not 100% sure. I haven't looked into it in a huge amount of detail, but I know it absolutely was something that occurred. Although you do have to bear in mind that in the interwar period, even between powers who would end up on opposite sides, there was still a certain degree of port visits and reciprocal visits and, well, just climb the nearest high point of the landscape and look out at enemy port facilities and so forth. So submarine reconnaissance wasn't as important as you might think. There would be a few little spy missions here and there to look at potential minefield routes or details of enemy coastal fortifications when they weren't perhaps looking, but in an era when you could just hire a private pilot to go and circle over Pearl Harbor and take photos of exactly what the harbor and the approaches looked like, you didn't really need to risk sending a full-scale fleet sub over to take a look. Leon Wu asks, apologies if this has already been asked, but how did they get ammunition to the oodles of 40mm and 20mm cannon on warships? Surely the guns had ammo lockers with some ready-use supply, but with the rate of fire that they could do, that would get used up pretty quickly in a major air attack. Did they just have dozens of runners scrambling up and down the ship carrying more clips of 40mm or drums of 20mm? Near enough, yes. Because you've got to remember that even for the more recently built ships that came with anti-aircraft guns as designed, any pre-warship came with very many fewer anti-aircraft guns in very specific places as compared to what you'd have by the mid to late war period. And so the vast majority of light and medium caliber anti-aircraft ammunition lockers and magazines would be pretty much improvised spaces, so that would not include things like hoists. You'd see hoists in later ships that were designed for it, but not so much then. So you can see here, this is the start of the ammunition chain for some 40mm rounds aboard a US warship. It's quite literally a guy in the magazine and another guy in a small hatch, and you pass things up. Now, you don't necessarily want to have loads and loads and loads of runners because they're going to wear out pretty quickly. But what you would have is essentially short link human chains. So in this case, this guy will be passing ammunition up to a guy who is on the other side of that hatch. He, in order to stop him having to get up and down and up and down and up and down all the time, will probably pass that ammunition to somebody who's standing, and they might then run that ammunition a short distance to somebody else who's perhaps outside the superstructure, or they might daisy chain it there. And there would then be points where you would build up ammunition, so perhaps ready-use lockers and so forth, and either members of the gun crew or additional members of the ship's crew could then run ammunition from these build-up points to the individual guns. You wouldn't have dedicated supply lines for each and every single gun installation leading all the way to the magazine. It would be the magazine feeding ammunition up to, as I said, designated pickup points, and from there it would be distributed to the various guns. Lord Druken asks, you've mentioned in several videos the US Navy fell into something of a decline after the American Civil War, to the point where it almost seems they missed out on the arms race in the age of the ironclads. Did the US Navy come up with any new designs during this period, or did they consider any such developments futile in the face of congressional recalcitrance? It depends if you mean ironclads or ships in general, because the US Navy did keep on building ships in general, various cruisers, a couple of late steam frigates, sloops, that kind of small stuff, although even then it was in fits and starts. In terms of actual ironclads, though, as far as I'm aware, they don't seem to have really come up with anything much in the way of full-scale ocean-going ironclads the way the big naval powers were building at the time. For the most part, it was concentrated on the sleight-of-hand efforts to gradually convert ships like the Puritan from a late American Civil War era monitor to something more closely resembling an ocean-going monitor dash extremely low freeboard proto Pre-Dreadnough, and of course its sister ships and half-sisters. Well, half-sisters, Puritan was kind of a one-off. And you can kind of see that in the ostensibly Puritan Amphitrite ships like that were all launched on paper in the early 1880s, but really don't commission until the middle of the 1890s. So any and all ironclad development in the US is basically concentrated on iterative versions of that. Nicholas Ressar asks, in a recent-ish video from Battleship New Jersey, Ryan made a hypothetical suggestion about putting radar on a Zeppelin to turn it into a proto-AWACS system. It got me wondering, how heavy were the early radar systems? Could you mount one on one of the US interwar Zeppelins in terms of weight and or power draw? Oh, you absolutely could mount radar on a Zeppelin from the interwar period. You're looking at weights for the early radars of around about 600 pounds for an ASV, or air-to-surface radar, and maybe 1,100 to 1,200 pounds for an air-to-air radar. Although that's the early versions, of course. As the war went on, lighter weight and better performing versions would be available. But given that you're talking about these Zeppelins that could carry potentially multiple aircraft, you're talking about airships that can have 20,000, 30,000 pounds useful load. So at that point, you could probably stick a couple of ASV radars, one looking forward, one looking aft. And if you really want to get ambitious, maybe even stick a quartet of air-to-air radars, one pointing in each cardinal direction. And then you'd have full 360 air-to-air coverage with backups in a lot of your overlapping sectors, plus full 360 air-to-surface radar coverage. And you still wouldn't even be at half the carry capacity weight of some of the interwar Zeppelins, which would allow you to install plenty of additional crew and supplies and fuel and so forth, or perhaps do so on a smaller Zeppelin. Smelly Kaka asks, prompted by Drydock 333's question about fast battleship misuse and earlier questions about swarms, if the US Navy for some reason had all their fast battleships in one place, with Yamato just over the horizon, how many would it actually make sense to send in without them getting in each other's way? And if not all 10, which classes and from which directions? I think if you want to strike a balance between overwhelming firepower and, not getting in each other's way, the optimal solution would be to send in the 4 Iowas, and I personally would split them into pairs and send them off at a 90-degree angle, roughly speaking, to each other, i.e. send one pair heading one way, one pair heading roughly the other way, trying to converge, basically trying to cross Yamato's T both fore and aft, because at that point, Yamato, admittedly, whichever way she turns, she can still engage with all her guns, but she's going to be forced to split fire in 2 completely different directions, and by having the ships in pairs, it means that even if one of them takes some pretty nasty hits from an 18-inch salvo, then Yamato is still being forced to split her fire rather than concentrate on a single target or a couple of targets on one bearing or the other. Now, the reason I choose the 4 Iowas and leave the South Dakotas and North Carolinas back is not really to do with protection, it's more to do with speed, because the Iowas are the ones that are capable of actually outrunning Yamato and therefore potentially outmaneuvering her and chasing her down much better than the South Dakotas or the North Carolinas could. They've also got the most powerful guns, but that's somewhat, to a certain degree, irrelevant. More to do with the fact that the US Navy did have colour die packs for their shells, and this is going to be very important in terms of getting in each other's way. There are only so many colours you can issue, and 4 ships, all firing, radar spotting to a certain degree is going to be helpful for establishing your fire control solution, but honestly, even with 4 ships firing, the chances of misidentifying via radar which salvo is yours and which salvo was somebody else's are relatively high. So even though you'll be using hopefully your radar for your fire control solution, refinements to that solution are probably going to be based largely on optical pickup. And in that case, you can split the colours available to the US Navy in terms of die packs across a 4-ship class relatively easily. Red, green, blue, colourless, and so forth. Whereas any more ships, and one, you're going to have to start restricting your formation speed to deal with the fact that South Dakota or North Carolina can't keep up. And 2, you are potentially looking at starting to double up on die colour packs. Whereas a 4-ship formation of Iowas theoretically is going to be more than enough firepower to put down a Yamato. As long as their visual spotting is good, they're not going to be interfering with each other's gunnery. And as I said, by splitting into 2 pairs, you're forcing Yamato to split fire, and you still have firepower in reserve even if one of your ships takes a bad hit. Farender Ritter asks, the revolt of the Admirals in the United States was due to potential drastic decreased funding for the Navy, with the money going to the Air Force, partly due to political appointments that were not the best picks, and also due to a warped view of new technologies coming out and the whole shiny and new is better. Fortunately, things worked out in the end, and the Korean War vindicated a traditionally strong Navy and naval air presence. Can you think of any similar occurrences during the Dreadnought era tech boom, where some rash thinking or decisions were halted, and it was later shown that halting those decisions was the right thing to do? There are certainly a few. I mean, You've got the British government's decision to start the Dreadnought arms race and then immediately try and pull funding from Britain's side of the Dreadnought arms race, which is the worst of both worlds, because you've not only rendered most of your own fleet obsolete, but now you're refusing to pay to continue building up your fleet, which means someone else, aka Germany, might be able to take over your position as prime fleet very quickly. Fortunately, the whole "we want 8 and we won't 8" rebellion by the public and the Navy stopped that. And as much as he was a visionary in many ways, Admiral Fisher's attempts to stop building traditional battleships and just build very fast, thin-skinned battlecruisers and submarines was a good thing to stop. Because, yes, technically speaking, now Fisher was right that submarines were the capital ship of the future, but that wasn't really the case in World War One. So, stopping surface warship production in favour of subs wouldn't have been a good idea. And likewise, as both World War I and World War II was going to show, the heavily armoured battleship still had a significant place in the line, whereas a thin-skinned battlecruiser, while it might have done okay in most circumstances, would have been very much in the wrong place at the wrong time in some. And something that you see across quite a number of navies, but the US and Royal Navies in particular, perhaps they've just got more surviving documentation, is that every so often, generally speaking, someone would look at, well, here are the guns we're using at the moment, here are the guns we're planning on upgrading to, but also here's some other guns that our gun manufacturers say they either have available or should have available very shortly, so why don't we go with those? And that would end up with disproportionate numbers of guns in terms of reduction of numbers of guns, because the hulls hadn't really caught up at that stage. So you sometimes will see suggestions of, well, we could have, let's say, 12, 14-inch guns or 10, 13.5-inch guns, and we could go to 8, 15, or 16-inch guns. Okay, that's not a bad idea. But then somebody else would go, yes, but we could also instead have 6 18-inch guns, or maybe 4 18-inch guns, or 4 20-inch guns, because that's theoretically possible on a hull of this size. And yeah, an 18 or 20-inch gun in the last part of the 1910s would have been a very fancy, all-singing, all-dancing, brand-new thing, much bigger and so forth than a 15 or 16-inch gun. But outside of HMS Furious, most of the time, people manage to say, no, we still need a reasonable number of guns. Reel your thoughts back in until we can build a ship big enough to fit a 16 or 18-inch gun in large numbers. Killer Rabbit asks, what would change in World War II for the Royal Navy had the Fleet Air Arm and Coastal Command been given to them in 1929? Now, we have covered the Fleet Air Arm either remaining with or going back to the Royal Navy relatively recently, so we'll go instead with the Coastal Command element of it. And I think the single biggest knock-on effect for the Royal Navy getting Coastal Command off the RAF would be the improvement in long-range reconnaissance aircraft. Because outside of a handful of admittedly fairly outstanding designs like the short Sunderland as seen here, the vast majority of Coastal Command patrol aircraft tended to be RAF Bomber Command cast-offs and hand-me-downs, Avro Ansons and things like that, which were okay for near-shore patrol of the British coastline. Even then, not particularly brilliant. But for long-distance patrols, you were pretty much down to Hudsons and Sunderlands, and the Hudsons mostly were in the RAF by sheer accident, considering a bunch of them had been destined for the French and then been diverted with the fall of France. So, yeah, you realistically want to be looking at if Coastal Command has come under Royal Navy control, for short-range attack missions, they're probably going to be sharing dive and torpedo bomber aircraft types with the Fleet Air Arm itself, which will be quite useful. And that in turn might lead to potentially actually slightly more advanced designs for the Fleet Air Arm, because obviously with pure Fleet Air Arm characteristics, you're looking for absolute best aircraft carrier handling statistics, possibly to the expense of performance. Whereas if you've also got land-based variants, you might end up with designs being selected that are perhaps just a little bit higher performance that can just about manage to operate from carriers. which would be good for fleet carriers, but perhaps maybe not quite so good for escort carriers, because a swordfish could take off from almost anywhere, but I suspect something a little bit bigger and chunkier and high performance might struggle. But long-range aircraft, you'd have much greater increased production, much better tie-in if they're part of the Royal Navy with Royal Navy operations, and with more experience in producing long-range patrol aircraft and them being available in larger numbers from the start, it would make life for the U-boats much tougher and therefore life for the Royal Navy much easier. Clement Gerdina asks, Germany used commerce raiders, both military ships and converted liners and merchant ships, in World War I and World War II. Did other countries do this as well, and if they did, what was their plan, what ships did they use, and did they put their plans into action? It kind of depends on how you define commerce raiders. If you define it as purely a ship that has set out with the express and primary purpose of destroying enemy merchant shipping as opposed to warships, then yeah, pretty much everybody used commerce raiders. It's just that most of those missions were relatively short duration. Obviously, we're excluding submarines here because they are the ultimate commerce raiders, but Force K at Malta, attacking Italian convoys like we saw in the Cruise and Destroyer Actions video number 2 recently. The J-class and Tribal-class destroyers that attacked the Torigo convoy would absolutely count as commerce raiders. They've set out with the express intent and purpose of destroying enemy commercial shipping, and, well, in that case, they succeeded. But, of course, they went out from Malta, they attacked shipping, they went back to Malta pretty quickly. And, likewise, occasionally US ships would go after Japanese merchant ships where they could, but it was very much an ancillary thing. Whereas if you're looking at long-distance commerce raiders, i.e. we're setting out on a several-week, potentially several-month voyage with the express intention of hunting down enemy merchant ships and only dealing with warships to the minimum extent possible, using surface vessels, the Royal Navy and the US Navy would initially try that at the very early part of the war, but not to huge success. You'd have a limited degree of things like blockade duty off the Bay of Biscay and so forth, looking for German blockade runners, but that's more part of a blockade than a commerce raiding. The Italians were stuck in the Mediterranean, which is the single worst environment to try and run commerce raiding because it's so small and confined, so pretty much not scratch that. The Japanese did try a few Hilfskreuz equivalents of their own, as well as a few raids into the Indian Ocean by heavy cruisers and so forth, but they generally didn't work out that well, partly because they went looking in the wrong places for Allied shipping, partly because Allied intelligence was on the ball and let Allied shipping know to get out the way, and partly because the occasional time they did find Allied shipping, it tended to go horrifically badly for them, such as when two Japanese armed merchant cruisers tried to take on a tanker and a tiny little corvette escort, and ended up getting the worst end of the stick when one of the Japanese ship's torpedoes was hit and the whole thing exploded and sank. Togfather asks, one of the many things I've learned from the channel is the importance of a ship's funnels when it comes to engine performance. Previously, I just thought they were there for getting the smoke away from the ship. I hadn't appreciated their role in airflow management. Given that funnel damage could reduce a ship's speed, did warship designers ever build in redundancy in the form of extra or larger funnels, or was that considered to use up too much internal volume and deck space? Pretty much the latter. I mean, here's a 3D diagram of a Yamato. Just look at how much internal volume is required to trunk all those boilers up into its funnel. And then you imagine, on ships with 2 funnels, you've got not quite that level of trunking, but a similar level repeated twice over, and so on and so forth. And you can see why there just simply isn't the internal volume to have multiple trunking to multiple funnels and so on and so forth. Not to mention you'd have to invent all kinds of complicated interlocks and exchanges that you'd somehow have to operate to divert funnel smoke from one funnel to the other. And a larger funnel won't really help you that much, because if you get a hole in it, you've got a hole in it, so you've lost your draft anyway. Now, occasionally, designers might, in aid of battle damage resilience, make choices between having 1 or 2 funnels and perhaps having 2, 3, or 4 funnels, but that would be more in terms of distributing the actual ship's machinery, because one disadvantage of having all your boilers in one place, although it's very efficient from a space layout perspective, is of course if you take a hit in that area, potentially you could lose your entire power plant all in one go. Whereas if you have your boilers and your turbines usually spaced out and alternating, i.e. the unit system, then, well, it's less efficient from a space layout perspective, but a hit in any one particular area might then only cripple part of your propulsion system rather than all of it. But if you're distributing your boilers in separate compartments all over the ship, then trunking them all together into one is just going to be completely impractical. So at that point, you would have multiple funnels, whereas in theory, you could get away with perhaps just one if you went with a single big grouping. And that, to a certain degree, is a form of having additional funnels, which also help with damage control and resilience, but that's more a byproduct of looking at torpedo and shell damage resilience than specifically choosing to have multiple funnels purely just in case one of them gets knocked out. HMS Implosive asks, you've mentioned a couple of times that you believe a 16-inch 50 Mark 7 would have benefited from using normal weight shells instead of AP Mark 8 Super Heavy shells at realistic battle ranges. Do you have any data, real or simulated, that actually shows this? I myself can't find any 16-inch 50 penetration or ballistics charts for using lighter shells, only super heavy ones. I haven't sat down with face hard or something like that to try and calculate things out step by step, although if anyone wants to, you're welcome to. But it's based partly on intuition and partly on something relatively simple. Look at the HE, or in American term HC, the high explosive shell, compared to the super heavy shell fired from the 16-inch 50. Now, this is a very conservative comparison. It favours the super heavy shell quite a bit for a number of reasons. Firstly, the high capacity shell is quite a bit lighter. It's about 400 or 500 pounds lighter than even the standard AP shell that you'd find in a 16-inch 45 on a Colorado. So it's going to be losing energy somewhat faster, and obviously the 2,240 odd pounds is much less than the Mark 8 shell. That's for the Colorado shell, by the way, is much less than the Mark 8 shell. So we're going a little bit too far, perhaps, in terms of reduction in mass. Also, the HC shell has inferior aerodynamics to the AP shell, and it has a slightly smaller charge in the first place, so not quite as much as we'd be used to chuck a Mark 8 shell downrange. And yet, even then, the crossover point where the superior speed retention capability of the Mark 8 starts to kick in is at around about 15,000 yards. Below 15,000 yards, even the, if it was an AP shell, aerodynamically inefficient and somewhat underweight HC shell is still actually hitting faster, and both in terms of speed and in terms of travel distance, than the Mark 8. And that says to me that if you kind of split the difference and you went with something like you'd have to develop it specifically for the Mark 7 gun, although I suppose you could reuse the old ones if you wanted to, but if you wanted to do it ideally, you'd maybe have a 2,350 pound shell with proper AP shell ballistics, that nice big windscreen, and of course with a bit more mass, have a bit more retention of velocity compared to the HC shell. Use the full power charge, your muzzle velocity will therefore be somewhat higher proportionally, and at that point, therefore, I think my intuition is that the velocity of the regular weight shell from a 16-inch 50 would therefore probably cross over with the AP Mark 8 at somewhere in the mid-20,000s of yards, and considering that the vast majority of battleship engagements in World War II happen below 25,000, 26,000 yards, it's going to be a slightly more optimal shell for those engagements, albeit, of course, that both shells are going to have ridiculous amounts of penetration. Just the normal shell will have slightly better penetration, slightly more absurd penetration, but it will also get there quicker and at a slightly shallower angle, which means the danger zone is greater for the enemy ship. Prusian TK asks, if some generous industrialist donated the SS Great Eastern to the Royal Navy, how would you, as the head of the Royal Navy at the time, militarise the vessel, assuming money for a military refit was not an issue? Well, spoiler alert, you may be seeing more on this later in the year, but I think broadly speaking, for the time period that Great Eastern was actually operational, it would depend on when the Royal Navy gets their hands on her, because she's in service, this is Great Eastern in 1859, she leaves service in 1889. Realistically, therefore, I think there's two potential areas or time periods when the Royal Navy might have her donated. But perhaps the more plausible one would be in the late 1860s, when she is done with her initial cable laying, but the opening of the Suez Canal has rendered a ship of her type and size a little bit obsolete. So if she's, let's say, for the sake of this answer, that she's donated at the end of the 1860s, well, you're looking at a period when there are a few turret ships around, but most ships are either older style broadside ironclads or newer casement or central battery ironclads. With Great Eastern, what I would be tempted to do, therefore, is that, well, we're going to need some magazine space, and we're going to need to obviously rip out a lot of the plush furnishings and cabins. So I would go with a central battery vessel, and I think there's a fairly easy way to actually accomplish this, which is simply to remove the paddle wheels. So probably replace the engines while I'm at it, since I'm ripping up a good section of the ship. Replace the engines with newer, more modern ones, because, well, engines installed in the mid-1850s versus the latest and greatest engines available at the end of the 1860s and early 1870s, there's a lot more power and reliability coming out of those. So I can replace the engines, and the massive amounts of coal that's stored will give me a huge operational range, completely take out the engine and coal reserves associated with the propeller, with the paddle wheels, as well as the paddles themselves. And that gives me a ready-made space and the displacement to install the mother of all central batteries roughly amidships. And so we're probably looking at maybe a dozen guns per side in probably a 2-layer battery. So 6 guns. So on each level, you'd have 1 firing forward, 1 firing aft, and 4 firing broadside, and potentially the 4 and aft ones could also be traversed to fire broadside. So 2 stacks of those, and then obviously on either side. You'd obviously have to slap a bunch of armour across the machinery and the central battery amidships, but you could also afford to lose most of the sails and masts, which would afford you quite a nice opportunity to, I don't know, do something with the upper deck space. Maybe some early anti-torpedo boat guns, because the anti-torpedo boat guns don't quite exist yet due to the lack of torpedo boats. But you could put plenty of storage and accommodation space for crew, or potentially add in lighter broadside guns fore and aft to deal with frigates and corvettes and that kind of thing, as opposed to your big heavy guns, which you could just use for capital ship combat. HMAS Albatross asks, I've been thinking about capital ship armour again. As I understand it, face-hardened armour is one of those long lead items in the construction of capital ships. Is this correct? Yes, it is. If so, did the major navies going into World War I have a store of spare armour? And if not, did they make do with homogeneous armour to repair battle damage in the short term until a proper replacement could be manufactured? And if navies did have a stockpile of replacement armour, was this eliminated by the Washington Treaty to stop navies from being perhaps overly cautious and having replacements for all the belt and turret armour for a class of ship, which could then be worked a bit to build ships more quickly, like was done to cut down Vanguard's build time by using Courageous and Glorious's turrets before her construction was paused for other reasons? There would be some limited stock of spare armour, but it's kind of a swings and roundabout situation, because ideally you should use armour plate that is as interchangeable as possible, but also, as you can see here from the slight curve, armour plate has to be adapted to fit the side of a ship's hull as the ship's hull curves. So armour plate for belt armour that is right fore and right aft on the Citadel probably has a lot of complex shapes to it, and storing spares of that really isn't that practical, because that's presupposing a hit on a very specific portion of the ship. Whereas storing some spare armour plate for plates that might be amidships on the Citadel makes a certain degree of sense, because even if the exact shaping isn't correct, it's going to be generally correct. But more broadly speaking, part of the reason that manufacturing armour plates was such a long lead item was firstly that you'd have to design up and draw up the exact dimensions and layout of every single piece of armour in question, and then you'd have to actually manufacture them all. And the manufacturing of any one single plate of armour, yeah, it's a long process, but it's not overly long in the grand scheme of things. Manufacturing several dozen or several hundred plates of armour for a given ship, yeah, now things start adding up quite a bit. So there would be very limited stocks of spare plate armour, plus plate armour that might have been planned for use on other ships but wasn't. So, for example, when refitted, when the Renown-class battlecruisers, when they realised that, well, having really thin armour probably wasn't that good, one of them used a bunch of spare armour plate that was left over from the proposed battleship Almirante Cochrane. Now, of course, a Renown-class battlecruiser and the Almirante Cochrane have completely different hull profiles, but with a little bit of finagling, they were able to make it work. So some generic spare plate armour would be kept around, not really affected all that much by the Washington Naval Treaty, and in fact, the Japanese, as we know, very carefully kept all the armour plate they took off of Hiei for a rainy day, and no one seems to have really challenged them all that much on that. They argued, I think, that they were going to use it as spares and repairs for the other three Congo class. But if a ship has taken some pretty hefty beating to its main armour plates, individually those plates can have specific replacements ordered from armour manufacturers, and they can arrive in reasonable time. But also, if your ship has taken such a heavy pounding that you need to replace a main armour plate, that ship's probably going to be in dry dock for quite a while, which obviously gives time for a replacement to be manufactured, especially considering that when you look at the damage of some of the German battlecruisers that took some pretty hefty hits on their armour plate, you'll often have supporting beams and bulkheads inside crumpled up and smashed. So you're going to have to be extracting not just the damaged armour plate, but then cutting out and restoring internal structure as well, all of which obviously adds to time spent in dry dock, and that gives your armour manufacturers more than enough time to manufacture bespoke replacement plates if you want them. Red Ranger asks, it's the early 1930s and a German engineer has put together designs for a submarine capable of carrying 2 platoons of troops along with all their supplies. The idea being that they could slip in under the cover of darkness ahead of an amphibious invasion and cause a nuisance to the logistical lines of a defending force. Had these submarines actually been put into production, what might they have actually ended up being used for, and what might they have looked like? So I suspect that, fancy futuristic sketches as shown aside, I suspect such a vessel, if they stopped and thought it through for a bit, might look a little bit like an I-400. Now, the reason I say that is because the I-400 is, along with a few other submarines of the Second World War, big enough to actually be a 2-deck submarine for most of its length. And of course, with the I-400 specifically, you've got a series of waterproof pods for aircraft above, and an utterly insane amount of fuel for extreme long distance travel, plus, double height torpedo rooms, etc., etc. So for an amphibious assault submarine, what I would suggest is halve the number of torpedoes. So maybe just have 4 torpedo tubes up front, nothing aft. And since you don't need to go around the world 1.5 times, you can drop a ton of the fuel and other associated spare parts and storage. So that should free up at least half, maybe even around about, I would say, half of the lower deck. And that can become accommodation for the troops. Then what you would do up top with the what's ostensibly on the I-400, the hangar, would be to smooth everything out into one long fairing. And then, since it's waterproof anyway, I would probably actually link that directly to the pressure hull. Now, this will, of course, limit the depth that you can dive with the sub somewhat, but hey, it's an amphibious assault submarine. It's not going down looking for the wrecks of ships 2 miles down or whatever, so it doesn't really make too much odds. And then their equipment and perhaps some extra accommodation and supplies can all go in this big fairing up top. So the troops would stay below with the rest of the crew, but have access to this upper area during the voyage. And then when it comes for the landing, you surface and then open the big front door on the upper chamber, and everybody can grab their supplies and pile straight out. Now, of course, this is going to be stupidly expensive, and ultimately is only going to deliver 100 to 120 troops or so. So in the event of a major amphibious landing, they're either not going to be useful at all, or you're going to need an awful lot of them, at least a dozen or so. And you've got to hope that your opponent really isn't all that good at anti-submarine warfare or coastal defence work. Because, of course, if you are going to actually carry out an amphibious invasion, usually the enemy has a reasonably good idea that you're coming and where you're coming, so there'll be defences on alert. So, for the Kriegsmarine, ultimately, probably actually not really practical, but if they had somehow pulled these things off construction-wise, they certainly could have been very useful in the Norwegian campaign, because you could have sent units of troops forward underwater, completely unseen, and I wouldn't necessarily use them to attack the Norwegian positions directly, but you could covertly put your troops ashore at night, let's say a day or two before your main invasion force sails, and they can go to ground, and then when the main invasion force shows up, then your already landed troops can attack from an unexpected direction, and also would be able to scope out what is and isn't operational in terms of enemy defences and the like. After that, unfortunately, there's not really a huge amount else the Germans could really use them for. I mean, Crete would involve them having to get into the Mediterranean in the first place, and something that large probably isn't going to last that long there. You don't really need small pockets of troops being landed ahead of the advance during Operation Barbarossa. Trying to land small raiding parties on the UK's coastline probably isn't going to end very well. I suppose if you were trying to do mass landings of agents or kamikaze raiding parties on the American coast, that might have some effect. But I rather suspect that part-way through the war, and fairly soon, I think, after the Norwegian campaign, Dönitz is just going to go, hey, gigantic milku, and stock them with absolutely everything a regular U-boat commander could possibly ever dream of, and use them as supply ships. J-Mace asks, the term cruiser came from the idea that these ships would be used for maritime patrol. How did the differences between types of cruiser, scout cruiser, protected cruiser, armoured cruiser, light cruiser, heavy cruiser, etc., affect how these different types of ship carried out that mission? So for most of those types, you would see that mission still ongoing, just with slight variations, which we'll mention in a minute. But of the types that you mentioned, the one that really actually doesn't do the classic cruising mission is the scout cruiser. Because by the time you get to the last part of the 19th century and then into the 20th century, although the mission profile of cruiser is still there, what is actually termed a cruiser really has kind of come to mean large warship that is not a destroyer or torpedo boat and bigger than these, but also not a battleship or battlecruiser, and smaller than those. Or in the case of armoured cruisers, smaller is perhaps a relative term. But in any case, the scout cruiser is, well, as the name suggests, almost exclusively designed as a fleet scout, an occasional flotilla leader. So they are pretty much combat cruisers designed, as I said, to lead smaller craft and destroy enemy smaller craft, and also be useful at spotting the enemy. So their maritime patrols, such as it is, about the closest you would get would be things like the Arethusa of the Harwich Force and things like this. Relatively short duration missions where they're mostly using their size and speed to bully smaller ships. The other types, the protected and armoured and light and heavy cruisers, they all did the classic maritime patrol mission, the variation being that in the earlier days, the protected cruiser would do more of the general showing the flag, suppressing the natives, guarding the merchant shipping, potentially attacking the merchant shipping, depending on who was doing what. Whereas the armoured cruiser was more of a foreign station flagship, suppressor and killer of other cruisers, mostly protected cruisers, and guardian of those protected cruisers against other armoured cruisers. Obviously being bigger, more heavily armed, and better protected, but would also occasionally be seen doing the maritime patrol, blockade, etc., as necessary. And the light and heavy cruiser are, to a certain extent, it's not a perfect analogy, but to a certain degree, their successors, in that although the light and heavy cruiser are not always, but very often much closer in size than a protected and armoured cruiser, and also considerably closer in protection. Of their main difference is, of course, their armament, although a portion of light cruisers would also come in at somewhat smaller than heavy cruisers, which, unless you're the York class, tend, outside of the very, very first ones, to be pretty much all around about 10,000 tons or slightly more, depending on how cheaty the nation in question is trying to be. And like the protected and the heavy cruisers, and protected cruisers kind of also take on some of the roles of scout cruisers in various fleets. The light cruiser is your long distance trade protection, commerce assault, flotilla leader, dog's body type vessel. The heavy cruiser is that little bit more powerful. It leads the smaller cruisers, it fights other cruisers. It is a station flagship in times of peace, and it's the final heavy screen for capital ships, whether they be battleships or aircraft carriers, where the need arises. So broadly speaking, the protected and light cruisers in their time periods would have a more general and widespread work, whereas the armoured and heavy cruisers would tend to have a little bit more of a focused mission. Reichspear Minister asks, with electricity only becoming common well after ship hulls had started to be made out of metal, how did the successor of the ship's carpenter do his work without electric lights? Well, in that period, so 1860 through to maybe 1875-ish, and then going into 1880 as things were refitted, the ship's carpenter was in fact still called the ship's carpenter. The role of ship's carpenter persists for a very, very long time because, as covered before, if you're going to be doing battle damage repairs, you're still going to be doing carpentry, and there's quite a lot of wooden fixtures and fittings inside the ship. Later on, you'll obviously have engineers taking over because it's all metal work, but that's sometime in the future, well after the advent of electricity aboard ships. As far as how to do his work without having electric light on board, well, it's a combination of things. If you go aboard HMS Warrior or some of the other preserved ironclads from roughly that time period, you'll notice they still have quite extensive skylights. They're not the open hatches that you might find on HMS Victory or USS Constitution. They're glazed, for one thing, but they will still let in a fair amount of light down through several decks, because then there'll be hatchways inside, fairly big covered grid-crossed ones. So you would have an element of natural light coming in from up there. You'd also have natural light coming in from the gun ports, which would be open. And you would have the same kind of lighting that you would have on a ship of the line in the era of sail, which would be things like lanterns and so forth, candles, and those actually could be moved around and used within the ship at considerably less risk, because although there's still a fair amount of wood fixtures and fittings, of course, the hull is iron, the structural members are iron, and if you've ever been aboard Victory and Warrior on the same day, you'll also know that there's an awful lot more space aboard Warrior, and therefore you're far less likely to trip and knock something over. So you'd use those traditional methods of lighting to see what you were doing. Gabriel A. Hawkins asks, there are several accounts of American sailors listening to the Tokyo Rose, as well as several similar British accounts concerning Lord Haw Haw and Axis Sally. During the treason trial of Eva Toguri, who was accused of being Tokyo Rose, the prosecution stressed how demoralising the broadcasts were. Did Allied sailors not realise they could simply turn off the radio, or was the Japanese version of We'll Meet Again and White Cliffs of Dover just that good? Well, as far as I'm aware, on both the Pacific and Atlantic sides of the war, although obviously listening to enemy transmissions was supposed to be forbidden, a number of them did tune in just to see what was going on. And that was because, realistically, when you look through the majority of testimony from various Allied sailors, they knew exactly what they were listening to. They knew it was enemy propaganda, and they usually listened to it partly just to have something different to listen to, partly because, hey, it was a little bit subversive, but without a huge impact on anything, and partly because a lot of them thought it was incredibly funny. Especially, well, I'm not sure about the exact details of Tokyo Rose because I haven't looked into it as much as I have with Lord Haw Haw, but certainly I know a lot of the British sailors who reported after the war that they listened to his transmissions basically viewed it as a free long-term comedy sketch, because it made such ridiculous exaggerated claims. Multiple times sailors would report that the Lord Haw Haw transmissions would say, yes, well, today the Luftwaffe has sunk this and that British warship, and the sailors on said British warship was sitting there going, "Oi, mate, do you remember being sunk earlier at 10 o'clock? No, mate, I think I'm good. No, I'm quite dry. Yeah, me too. Oh, well, guess we're sunk, but we don't know it." And then they'd all have a good laugh about it, which was quite fun. So, yeah, there were, of course, a few who either took it at face value or just found it a little bit demoralising, but they seem to have been very much in the minority. And from my limited, and I do stress limited, understanding of what was going with the Tokyo Rose broadcasts, generally speaking, the reality seems to have been that what American sailors did tune into those broadcasts generally did so, again, out of more of a let's all point and laugh at the hilariously obvious enemy propaganda. And the trial of Eva Toguri seems to have been extremely heavily prejudiced right from the start, complete with threatened witnesses and basically blackmailed to say this, that, and the other. So I don't think the prosecution saying, no, the Tokyo Rose broadcasts were completely demoralising, was really telling the truth, because both from what little amount, admittedly, of US sailors' testimony I've read about listening to it, and what I've heard from various museum ships, when obviously they've had a lot more in-depth research into their ship's veterans, it seems to be it was more just, hey, the Japanese are broadcasting some free comedy and occasional skits and music. Let's have a tune in and see what they've got for us today. Feckler's Fickle Fictile Fettler, fourth finest Fettler Feckler forged for foreign fictile fettling forays, asks, what was the first ship designed from the outset for transatlantic voyages to the New World, and what new design changes were present? Did any of these changes become commonplace? I think it depends very much on what you mean by designed for transatlantic voyages. Do you mean designed specifically to do the run from Europe to America and back in the age of steam and steel, which would be a very different thing, because then you're talking about stuff like, especially given early engine efficiencies, extremely large coal bunkers and things like this? Or do you mean actually going way back, as in first ships designed for long-distance transoceanic trade from Europe, which is an entirely different matter? Assuming that you mean the latter, you'd be surprised that actually there isn't a huge amount of change, because and therefore, obviously, it's very difficult to say, right, this is a ship specifically designed for the transatlantic trade, whereas this ship is not. Because prior to that, you did have long distance trade, trade from Northern Europe into the Eastern Mediterranean, which involved going all the way around Europe, and obviously also long distance trade to what was called the East Indies, so the Spice Islands, what we would today call Indonesia and India. And although that involved a fair bit of hopping along, there were long stretches down Africa and even longer stretches going out across the Indian Ocean. So the idea of a large ship, with at least large for the time, with a significant internal volume, both to carry supplies to get the crew there and to transport sufficient goods back to make it all worthwhile, wasn't exactly unknown. And the fact it had to deal, for the most part, with Northern European waters also meant they tended to be built sternly enough to withstand whatever might be thrown at them weather-wise. So at that point, large trading galleons and trading carracks and stuff already existed, which were pretty much exactly the right kind of ship to use on a transatlantic voyage. The difference being that whereas going, shall we say, to Southeast Asia, you could do it in a big ship and you'd make theoretically the most money doing so. You could also do it in a relatively small ship by hopping along. Now, of course, you could also do the transatlantic voyage in a relatively small ship. In fact, when you look at the size of Nina and Pinta, heck, just look at the size of Santa Maria, but Nina and Pinta especially, the Columbus's ships, turns out you can do the transatlantic voyage in some suicidally tiny ships, even in that time period. But ideally, you'd want to do it in a larger vessel. And so after a short period of time, once transatlantic trade, obviously initially with the Spanish colonies and then later with English and Dutch and French colonies in the New World got going, there tended to be a kind of, you have to be at least this large to reliably participate in the Atlantic trade, although that was mostly dictated by commercial interests. Because, as I said, if you're going to have to pay a merchant crew to go out at sea for months and months and months at a time, then that's going to be a fair amount of expense you're going to build up, at which point you need the return cargo, or later on once the triangular trade got started, the cargo in both directions, to be making enough profit to justify the whole thing. And thanks to the square cube law, a bigger ship is going to return proportionally a much greater profit than a smaller one. But when you took the equation out of the mercantile aspects and it was just about, can you physically cross the Atlantic? Well, it turned out you could cross the Atlantic, as I mentioned, in some pretty darn small craft. Sloops and corvettes, if you were French, and picket boats and that kind of thing regularly made transatlantic crossings for warlike purposes. Ferrata Victrix asks, what is your favourite gimmick, quirk, or clever mechanic you've seen in naval war games and computer games? Anyone here old enough to remember playing ye good old Navy Field original flavour? Yeah, I put far too much time into this game back when it came out. So there were two mechanics in that game which I found hilariously funny, and I think probably have caused me the most uproarious laughter and enjoyment of any naval war game on a computer I've ever played. One of which was a fairly logical one, so you could have different types of fire control system. Two were manual, one was automatic. They may have included more in the later stages of the game's life cycle, I don't know. I only played it for the first 2 or 3 years. But there was an automatic one, which was kind of a click, and it would aim the guns for you. The downside was that your spread was significantly larger, so the chance of scoring a hit per salvo were relatively low, but your shells would be somewhere in the right vicinity at all times. The other two were manual, and at that point you had to learn how to operate your keyboard keys pretty quickly, because you needed to use 2 keys to slew your guns. One slewed your aft turrets, one slewed your forward turrets, and the other one controlled the elevation. Now, you had little range markers. They weren't numbered, but it was, pip, 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 etc. And you then also had to obviously learn how to use the keys to increase and decrease your elevation. And the two types were essentially fast or accurate. So one fire control system type, your guns slewed and elevated really quickly, but was somewhat less accurate, whereas the accurate one, as you can probably guess, didn't aim quite as quickly, but the shells would be the most accurate of the three fire control types. Now, if you could learn to estimate your range and lead your shots, then what they call the aiming fire control system, you can see here has been fitted on this Fletcher, would become hilariously broken, because you could land almost full salvos on an enemy ship time after time after time, no matter what hilarious evasive maneuvers they happened to do. Now, of course, if you're up against someone else who also had good spatial awareness, well, it was down to whoever got shots off first, but it was quite fun. It rewarded those with an excellent sense of spatial awareness and a dab hand on the keyboard. But the much, much funnier element was that each of your gun emplacements was limited in what you could take, not by any particular considerations of stability or sanity, but purely by a weight class. So it was optimized around the historical armament, supposedly, for each ship, but there was a little bit of leeway in each one, and to account for improvements and so forth. And above that, you couldn't take anything. So you couldn't do something ridiculous like put a triple 15-inch turret where there was a triple 6-inch turret, because that is far too much weight. But you could perhaps get a town class, which would ordinarily have triple 6s, and refit it with twin 8s if you wanted. Now, one thing which was very broken when it initially came out, and I believe I'm told at some point they later patched out, was that the single 18-inch gun, aka the one you got on HMS Furious, turns out, thanks to being a relatively lightly protected turret, to have a weight, at least in Navy field, that wasn't all that much higher than the twin 8-inch guns that you could fit on a county. Or more specifically, it didn't weigh much more than 2 of them, because your front turrets and your aft turrets were, I believe, grouped overall in terms of weight as well. I mean, you can see again on here each turret's weighting. So what this meant was that, yes, it was entirely possible to fit a single 18-inch gun on the fore or aft of your county class. And of course, people put all sorts of different things on, but if you had your manual FCS, then what you could end up doing was fitting something really rapid firing, like say a 666 on your forward mountings. So you could have 2 666s on the forward mountings of your county class and charge at the enemy, and they'd say, oh look, yeah, it's another machine gun ship firing loads of 6-inch shells. That's fine, I've got loads of deck armor, I'll just bounce the shots. And he's charging in to die. So, and what the heck has he got on his stern? And then boom, ridiculous damage. Completely implausibly done historically. Absolutely hysterical to actually play. If the gods had wanted us to be happy, they would have given us a honey-based alcoholic beverage. Oh Look Mead asks, between 1900 and 1910, which 2 to 4 ships built or modernised, excluding HMS Dreadnought herself, would you say from the breaker's yard based on engineering grounds? So this is in a series of questions that our wonderful Mead boy has been asking us, basically, I think, walking back the same question through the decades. So for this period, it's going to be, firstly, I think, no particular order, but firstly, definitely the Edgar Quinet class armoured cruisers of France, because they're very interesting ships in and of themselves, and also some of probably the best armoured cruisers, in my opinion. I would also save either Lord Nelson or Agamemnon as a nice example of a last generation pre-Dreadnought. I think I'd also save the Russian cruiser Rurik, Again, following the rules we have done for previous questions of this type, where we're not saving ships that were sunk in action, otherwise we could save Blucher, but Rudder is probably a good example of that intermediate stage between the armoured cruiser and the battle cruiser. And keeping with the theme of that kind of borderline zone between the pre-dreadnoughts and their design ilk and the dreadnoughts and their design ilk, I'd probably also save the Tsukuba, the Japanese armoured cruiser that would later be re-rated as a battle cruiser because it's essentially a pre-dreadnought battle cruiser. Elliot W. James asks, if you could preserve any French pre-dreadnought, starting with Hoche and ending with Suffren, as a museum ship, which would you choose and why? As tempting as it would be to preserve Carnot, mostly on the grounds that I'd love to see her run as an actual hotel, I think if my choice is somewhere between Hoche and Suffren, I would have to go with this one, the Jariguiberi, or the one that starts with a J. Much as I'm very tempted to go with Hoche, I think if you were going to go with anything that was built in, well, what loosely counts as mainstream French pre-dreadnought construction and absolutely encapsulates the steampunk madness of being a French pre-dreadnought without being Hoche herself, it's this thing. So yeah, this would be the one I would preserve. If I'd much as I would love to go with Hoche, she's right on the edge of between being a late era ironclad and a pre-dreadnought, whereas with this one I can very, very safely say absolutely this is a pre-dreadnought. Coneled asks, how many Des Moines-class cruisers would it take to be a fair match against each of the last-generation battleships from the major World War II navies, assuming that each of them had survived to face the other? Assume combat occurs on a clear day, calm waters, so no significant advantage on either side in crew or command competency. So, broadly speaking, I think you can put this into 4 categories, and it's largely based on speed. So for the last generation US battleships, it's obviously the Iowas. Now, they are a outright speed match for the Des Moines, which means that they can dictate the range. They have as good fire equipment, control equipment as the Des Moines. So in theory, an Iowa could exploit the matched speed to just hold the range at a range that favours the 16-inch guns, either by flat out outranging the Des Moines or engaging at a distance where the Des Moines 8-inch can't hurt anything vital on the Iowa, but the Iowa can obviously smash up the vitals of the Des Moines. At which point, assuming that engines, etc., hold out, you'd need a fair number of Des Moines. I would say at least half a dozen in order to basically outlast the Iowa, because the one disadvantage of fighting at that kind of range is the number of hits you're going to score is going to be somewhat lower. So if you had about half a dozen, I think enough Des Moines would be around when the Iowa started to potentially run short of shells that they can eventually track the Iowa down and then blitz it with 8-inch shells. At the other extreme of speed, you've got Japan and obviously Yamato. Now, Yamato is a really big threat. She's got huge guns, can erase a Des Moines pretty easily, and has a lot of armor. However, the Yamato is about 3 knots slower, so Des Moines can be fairly easy to catch up and overhaul her. Again, Yamato does have a big range advantage, but I would say that maybe 4 Des Moines would be needed to take out a Yamato. You would probably lose 1 or 2 on the way in for them to get into range from 18-inch salvos, but 2 or 3 surviving Des Moines going full rapid fire on a Yamato will probably smash up enough stuff that Yamato starts to be very inaccurate with ranging and then subsequently on fire. Germany, Italy, and the UK, I'm going to all put into roughly the same bracket, essentially because you're all looking at 30-knot battleships with 15-inch guns, and in the case of Vanguard and Bismarck, they've even got the same armament layout with 2 twins forward, 2 twins after. Littorios have obviously 3 triples. Now, Littorio accuracy issues aside, this is a bit of an interesting one because, again, battleship guns more than capable of smashing up Des Moines, but all 3 ships are capable of around about 30 knots, which means the Des Moines are faster, but not by a huge amount. But conversely, Bismarck, Littorio, and Vanguard are not anywhere near as heavily protected as Yamato is. Well, 1 or 2 might come close, but still not anywhere as close, as heavily armoured as Yamato, and more to the point, also nowhere near as massive, which means they just have less mass to soak up punishment. So in those cases, I think I would probably actually stick to the 4 that you sent after Yamato, because 15-inch shells slightly less likely to do critical damage, so you might need to score a few more hits on them, but the rate of closure is going to be halved, which means that the battleships can keep the enemy at a distance where they can engage and the Des Moines can't for longer. So you probably lose, again, probably 1 or 2 before the surviving 2 or 3 getting range and the deluge of 8-inch gunfire begins. And that just leaves France. Now, France is in a bit of an odd position in that, more closely to the US, Richelieu can go easily above 32 knots, which means she's near enough as makes no difference, almost on a par with the Des Moines for speed. But all her armament is up front, which means that either she can kite for a very, very long time, but if she wants to actually engage them, then she can do over-the-shoulder firing, but it is going to have to be at a slight beam angle, which means that she is going to probably have to sacrifice a small amount of overall forward speed. So she might still be going 32 knots, but if she's going diagonally and the Des Moines are going in a straight line, they will close her down a little bit quicker. So at that point, again, I would reckon probably about 4, because yeah, there's going to be a really long crawling haul to catch up with her, but there is actually a gun shadow in which the Des Moines can hide, and as they try and close things down. Now, of course, Richelieu can maneuver to try and bring them out of that gun shadow, but every time she does, she slows down a little bit. So I'd say for most of the capital ships, you're probably looking at 4, maybe 5 Des Moines in that kind of scenario to hunt them down. However, the exception to that being the US, because the Iowas can match the speed of the Des Moines, and at that point it's basically chase the Iowa until either she runs out of fuel or ammunition, at which point you need a few more. And finally, for this half of the Patreon Drydock, Lord Druken asks, how much did the use of rams during the American Civil War influence other navies regarding ramming during the Ironclad Age? Putting rams on ships during the Civil War made some level of sense, since the ships were expected to go up against wooden hulls of older warships, or in the case of CSS Virginia, iron casements still set on wooden hulls, but it would seem that as fully iron and steel warships became more common, and in an engagement of ships with similar to equal displacements, ramming wouldn't be considered as effective. It certainly, I would say, encouraged people to think about rams. Now, of course, if you're designing a ship that is going to be armoured theoretically against all incoming fire, you're probably going to start thinking about the ram anyway, because, well, if you build something and your enemy builds the same thing, well, great, now you've got 2 ships that can destroy everything else but would pound away at each other all day with not a lot happening. So, logically speaking, rams were coming one way or the other, but usefully for everybody else, the Americans deciding to have their Civil War in the early 1860s, right at the dawn of the Ironclad era, meant that, well, they could observe firsthand the effectiveness of ramming, at least by smaller ships in coastal water environments, and, as you said, against older ships like poor old USS Cumberland here. And this is a thing that I think people do need to understand. Ramming as a tactic was being thought of pretty much from the word go in the Ironclad era. Obviously, there had been ramming and such in the Age of Sail, but specifically, Roman trireme style ramming with the specific intent of punching a hole below the waterline in your opponent was right there from the get-go of the Ironclad Age, What LISA does, a little bit down the line, is, at least from a perception perspective, it's perceived as proving that what the American Civil War had indicated could work on a small scale could in fact also work on a large-scale encounter between major capital ships. Because although iron and steel warships becoming more common and ships having similar to equal displacements might seem to counter the effectiveness of ramming, the fact was that ramming was more proportional on your mass and your speed. And as things like even as far as Camperdown and Victoria showed, simply because you had ships of roughly equal mass didn't really make one or the other invulnerable to ramming. It just meant the rammer might take a bit more damage as compared to, in the 1860s or 1870s, where the rammer might be a big 9, 10, 12,000 ton ironclad and the Ram E might be a 3, 4, 5,000 ton wooden ship of the line. But ultimately a hole below the waterline is a hole below the waterline, whether it's punched through timber or whether it's punched through steel or whether it's punched through iron. And with armour obviously at points in the late 19th century looking like it might win the race between guns and protection from guns, there was a certain degree of logic to maintaining ramming. But of course, the crucible for that being a combination of the American Civil War in principle and then LISA in practice for capital ship engagements. Well, that's the first 50-odd questions out of the way. On to the next 50-odd questions.